The main character's name is Reina. She is a surgeon and she has one secret. Then the girl proudly dedicated her life to helping others, but everything changed when she drowned. Reina has already woken up in a world where medical practice is stolen by death. But when the protagonist found him, Reina couldn't let him die. As it turned out, his name is Zared, and he is the captain of the Royal Guard. In exchange for saving his life, he took the girl to a safe house in the royal palace, and now the protagonist is disguised as a man. Not only does she have to keep her gender a secret, but also Reina has become the physician of His Highness Prince Damien himself. Prince Damien is cold and indifferent. He steadfastly refuses treatment. But they will see about that. There is one difference between the prince and his guard: that Reina is actually a girl. But Damien doesn't know that. But despite that, the protagonist is growing closer to them, not to mention being told to let the girl come to her senses. Because with her new allies, the protagonist is going to reform this backward world and give proper medical care to people who need it, as the prince's personal physician. At this time, Prince Damien is sitting at his desk reading papers. Suddenly, someone walks in and addresses His Highness. He is told that Zared requests an audience. He will also bring a guest. Then Prince Damien says, "Let them come in." At this point, Zared turns to His Highness and says that he has heard that Mr. Fraze's partner has fallen ill, and so Damien is here to offer a replacement doctor. At this point, Zared suggests the main character, who has already been reincarnated as a guy. The prince asks, "What noble lineage is this guy from?" Damien says that they ended up bringing a peasant to the prince. But Reina wasn't a noble guy or a peasant since she's not even from this world. Not that Reina could tell them such things, but she didn't understand why she was the youngest surgeon in her department who graduated Harvard Medical School at the top of her class. Standing there with bandages on her chest in men's clothing, the downcast prince calls her a peasant. But this is a story the protagonist wants to start at the beginning. When Reina was working at the hospital, she got a call that there was a patient after a traffic accident, and there is a man in the emergency room here. He's 24 years old and was found drunk driving with blunt abdominal trauma. The patient is unstable and admitted to triage in a coma. Reina asked. If he's unstable, she suspects the guy has spleen damage, and they may have to do an emergency abdominal surgical incision. Reina says that's where she'll be. After some time in the operating room, the doctors talk about how stable this guy is. The main character didn't expect him to survive with those injuries. One nurse talks about how the rumors don't lie that the protagonist really does have golden hands. Reina talks about how the doctors are very kind and they couldn't have done all of this without them. One nurse talks about how they are planning to have a drink tonight. She asks the protagonist if Reina can come along with them. But the protagonist apologizes. She says that she has an information program tonight, so they should have fun without her. In the evening, the girl went to the bus and got a message from a guy named Kai. He asked where the girl was, where she was right now. But before that, he sent her a message and asked if Reina wanted to accept his proposal. He said Reina could marry him and take over the hospital. He asked if Reina didn't want to offer. But the girl did not respond to this message. Then Kai kept on asking, "Is Reina going to work in this tiny, pathetic hospital forever, not volunteering in the slums?" The guy said Reina is wasting her talent in nothing, and she's capable of so much more, and Kai can help her. He asked what else the girl wanted from the man. He was a doctor too. Reina started to get angry and said that this stupid guy really doesn't know how to take no for an answer, and Reina should reject him nicely. The girl wanted to say just so he won't text her anymore, but Reina decided that she's not that rude, and she has manners after all. But after only one moment, the girl accidentally sent that message. That's when Reina started to get nervous, and she hoped that everything would be okay. This spoiled guy should at least take her hint now. Reina used to think Kai was harmless, rich, spoiled, and bossy, but harmless. They were classmates in medical school. At first, the guy left the girl alone until they got into the same residency. It wasn't until later that Reina found out that it was actually his father who owned the hospital. Reina thought he really couldn't take her rejection for an answer, but in reality, he still can't do that. But no matter how many times he asked a girl out, Reina would never agree to go with a guy like Kai. After a while, the girl is already walking down the road. She thinks about how hungry she is. She asks herself what she should cook tonight. She thinks of making spicy soup or tofu or maybe even seafood noodles. At that moment, it starts to rain. The girl tries to see something ahead, but suddenly a guy grabs her hand. She asks the guy, "What is he going to do in this place?" But the guy talks about what he asked the girl politely. This is the same guy, Kai. Reina says her answer will remain the same, and she's told him that 1,000,000 times. Kai talks about how he's serious. He asks, does Reina really want to spend the rest of her career with stupid people when Reina could be on top with him? The main character asks to be allowed to just leave. Kai says it must be sad. After all, Reina comes home every day to an empty apartment to sleep in an empty bed. But Kai knows it's hard to be an orphan, but girls, they are bound to be alone forever. The girl gets angry and she slaps her hand on the guy's face. She wonders what Kai could possibly know about her. Just because he's the son of some important CEO doesn't give him the right to say whatever he wants. The right to say whatever he wants. And those stupid people they all mock are needy people, not that kind of spoiled boy. As Kai would understand how that feels. Offended and frustrated, the main character turns around and starts to walk away. Kai tries to stop her. He tells her to let Reina come back. He suggests the girl go at least under an umbrella, but Reina doesn't listen to him and she runs away. At this point, Reina finds herself a road that goes to the water. She walks onto the pier. Kai approaches the girl on Reina. Step by step enters back. The girl does not see where she is going. Kai offers to talk it over, when both are drying off from the rain. Kai doesn't want the girl to get sick, but Reina says she has nothing to say to the guy. She asks that Kai should just leave her alone. At this point, the girl gets very close to the water with her foot. She steps back and starts to fall. It's quite deep in there. Kai tries to catch the girl, but Reina plunges into the water. After some time, Reina wakes up. When the girl opened her eyes, she started getting angry at the guy and talking about how he is impudent and spoiled. When the protagonist got up, she could not understand what place she got into. But that's when she noticed 2 moons in the sky. The protagonist gets scared and she doesn't realize where she is. She wonders if she fell off the pier. She hopes it's still Earth. The girl walks through the woods trying to find a living soul. She thinks it must be a dream, and now she's probably being treated in a hospital. But Reina doesn't understand why. Then she feels hungry in her sleep. Suddenly the girl trips over something and starts to fall. There sits a very injured guy under a tree. Reina asks, "Is everything okay with the guy?" She doesn't understand what happened to him. The girl tries to help him. Reina says the guy has a frequent heartbeat that is above normal, but the guy's blood oxygen saturation is fine. Reina wants to watch his wound and wash it. Reina asks why she's even talking to this man if he's unconscious. The main character tries to pick the guy up and put him on the ground. She sees that he has a very large wound. The girl thinks about the fact that she's going to have to stitch it up since it's a pretty deep wound. She doesn't understand what this guy could have cut himself so badly, but at least the guy's lucky she's got all the essentials with her. The girl has a flashlight in her mouth and is trying to shine it on herself to see what she's doing. At this point, the girl stitches up the guy's wound and tells him that everything is ready. And that should be enough for now. Thinks about how she's really tired and she thinks she should stay with this guy to make sure he's okay. After some time, the protagonist fell asleep and the guy already opened his eyes. The guy doesn't understand. Did the woman really heal him? He sees that the girl is sound asleep and she must be exhausted. At that moment, the guy lifts the girl in his arms. The guy starts to carry the girl, and suddenly he sees that there is a horse standing there. In his arms, with the main character, gets on the horse and they start to ride. He decides to take the girl to the safe place. In the morning, the protagonist has already opened her eyes. She is lying on the bed and does not understand what is happening. The guy wishes the protagonist good morning and he calls her his savior. But he asks if it might be better to say that the girl is a witch. Reina doesn't understand what the guy's talking about. She asks where she is and what this place is. She doesn't understand why the guy brought her to this place. She asks who he is. Guy replies that he should ask the girl the same thing. He asks why she was in the woods so far from the capital. Not to mention it was in the middle of the night. Reina says that's what she's lost about. The guy asks where the girl is from. After all, there is no village near where they were. Reina tells him that she is somewhere far away from that place, and she doesn't really know how she can get back to her home. The boy thinks about how he's never seen clothes like this before, Or even he's never seen one of her country tools in a bag before. But it looks like the girl is telling the truth. The guy talks about how he regrets it. But regardless of where she's from, the girl saved his life, and for that, he's incredibly grateful to her. Reina says it's not her problem, and her job is helping people, and she's a doctor. The guy says that, and Reina shouldn't talk about it so freely. He asks if she doesn't know she could be accused of witchcraft. Reina is incredibly surprised at being called a witch. The protagonist asks why she has to be a witch. It's not like she was traveling and stumbled into the medieval period or anything. Reina is incredibly surprised. She asks, has she stumbled into one of those weird Ren isekai? The guy talks about how he knows it might sound weird, but the girl isn't from here and he means it. She could have been executed as a witch and he's seen this kind of thing before. And Reina asks how there could be an execution because she's a doctor. But the guy says it's not because she's a doctor, it's because she's a female doctor, and especially with her powers. The guy offers to help the girl find her way back to her house. Reina thanks the guy, but she thinks it's impossible. The guy understands her. He suggests that she listen to his offer. He doesn't know if she's really a witch or not, but he can protect her. He starts by asking her what her name is. Reina says she's not a doctor and her name is Reina. The guy says the girl can trust him. After all, she saved his life, which means he will save hers. At this point, the guy picks up some bandages and scissors. Reina asks what it's for, but the guy doesn't say anything and puts a bowl on the girl's head. Reina says, that guy can save her life, but she doesn't want him to approach her with scissors. The guy tells Reina to trust him since she needs a disguise, and he's also good at cutting hair. That's not what he promises. After a while, the girl looks in the mirror and her hair is cut short. She asks, did the guy just bring her here to mess with her? But the guy says he didn't, and it's just a haircut. It's also pretty popular. The guy hands the girl bandages to wrap around her breasts, so the girl can wear the clothes he wore when he was younger. The guy says that when Reina is ready then, no go. The main character asks where they should go. After all, she doesn't even know the guy's name. The guy says the girl needs a new name as well. He asks how about calling her Ren. At this point, the guy says his name is Zared. He is a captain of the Royal Guard. Also, the guy is going to take the girl to the only place that will be safe. That's how the protagonist ended up in this place. The prince says it's good that Master Faraz is here too, and maybe he can appreciate this boy's skills. Faraz agrees with His Highness's words. At this point, Zared asks to be heard. At this point, the boy takes off his shirt and asks for permission to show the doctor's work. At this point, the boy shows his stitch on his body. Zared says that this boy saved his life. Damien asks if this boy attended a medical university founded by the church. Zared asks the main character if he attended the university. Reina replies that she didn't, but she's already a licensed surgeon in her world. The prince asks what makes the captain think this guy has the ability to become a palace doctor. The prince asks what if this guy can't do anything but carefully stitch up wounds. Reina realizes that's fine and places she'll be a doctor for the farmers. They can grow their own food. Damien talks about how he's confident in this guy's talent. His Highness talks about how if Damien wasn't his friend, he would have thrown him out of this room a long time ago. At this point, the prince turns to the master and asks what Master Faraz thinks about this. The master replies that even if Sir Damien vouches for him, he sees no redeeming qualities. Suddenly, someone knocks on the cabinet. A man comes in and he is sorry to interrupt His Majesty, but he says that Master Faraz is urgently needed in the infirmary, for Ralph's son, Urgis, is in terrible pain, and he is told that his condition is getting worse every day. The boy apologizes for distracting His Highness, but Damien says that the man is free. At this moment, Reina is thinking that it's bad if the guy's condition is worsening right now. Suddenly, the protagonist turns to His Highness and asks if she can go to the infirmary. After all, she is worried about the child's condition. After thinking for a bit, the prince agrees and says that Ren can go and see. After a while, Reina walks into the room where the kid is lying and the master is trying to help him. Urges has vomited painfully often at least 4 times. He also has a fever and lost his appetite. The wallpaper in his stomach has suddenly moved. The pain is now on his lower right side whenever he moves. Master Faraz speaks of having seen many similar cases like this. He feels sorry for a man named Ralph. The master says that even with the help of their medicines, they won't be able to help him. and the foreman is afraid this guy won't live to see tomorrow. Ralph starts to cry, because he knew that even with the high priest's inventions, it still wouldn't be enough. But he'll do anything to save his son. He'll do anything. The protagonist gets tears in her eyes, and she remembers how in her life a father cried over his child. At this point, the protagonist talks about the boy needing emergency surgery, and she is ready to save his life. Reina thinks about the fact that drawing attention to herself is very risky, but she can't stand by when someone needs help. She goes to Mr. and tells him that if he can really give anything to save his son. The girl asks him to let her do it. After all, it is a simple operation, and she has done it over 100 times. At this point, Master Faraz tells Ralph not to listen to this guy. After all, he is a commoner with no medical training. This guy has no idea what he is saying. At this point, Ralph asks, "Will the guy really be able to save his son?" Reina says it's a simple procedure. Ralph replies that then the guy has his permission, and if there is even the slightest chance, then they have nothing left to lose. At this point, Reina thanks the man. After a while, the protagonist approaches the guy who is very sick. The girl apologizes and says that she will do some physical tests. The guy doesn't understand what the doctor is telling him, but at that moment, the protagonist tries to understand with her hand what hurts the guy. The girl then concludes that the guy has acute appendicitis. At this point, Reina says that the kid needs emergency surgery before it's too late, and she can do the surgery right now. The man tells the doctor to do whatever it takes just to save his son. Master Faraz asks, how can Ralph leave his son in the hands of this inexperienced boy? After all, he could be a butcher. Ralph asks, does the master have any better ideas? After all, his son is dying on this bed, and Faraz said so himself. Faraz gets angry, he turns around and leaves. He says Ralph can do what he wants, but he must remember that Ralph himself asked for it. Master Faraz turns around and addresses the protagonist. He says that if the child dies on the operating table, he will order his heresy. At this point, Zared approaches the protagonist and says that he knows she can do it. That's why he wants the protagonist to take it easy. Reina has no idea what she's gotten herself into, but she's going to save this guy no matter what. After 3 days, the protagonist sits on her bed and thinks about how she wonders how Ira is doing now. After all, she can't even leave the room to check on him since she's still under house arrest. Reina thinks about how everything happened really fast. She thinks back to how their operation started. The girl was lucky that Ralph had some surgical experience and he was able to help her. And it turns out there are even primitive anesthetics and antiseptics in this world, which Reina had seen in museums before. Fortunately, the operation went smoothly. But without modern instruments and protective equipment, there's no guarantee that the child will recover. And Reina can only hope and pray that he's okay. The girl realizes she shouldn't be so picky, but the porridge the servants brought was terrible. At that moment, someone starts knocking on the girl's door, turns out to be Zared. Reina says the guy can come in. Zared talks about how it must be boring for the girls to be cooped up here alone. He asks the prince if she could go out a little bit, but the prince says it can be done on the condition that Zared keeps her company. Zared asks the girl if that would be okay. The protagonist agrees and offers to go to the infirmary together. After a while, they reach the infirmary and are met there by Master Faraz. Faraz asks the protagonist what makes her think she will be able to prove herself. Reina replies that she just wants to check how Ira is feeling right now. Reina asks, is everything okay with the boyfriend? But Da doesn't answer that it's none of the guy's business. He tells the guy to get out of this place immediately, or he will throw him out of here himself. At this point, Master Faraz is approached and talks about the patient. Faraz says he'll be right over. Zared and the protagonist turn around and leave. At this point, Master Faraz checks on the woman's health. At this point, a little girl grabs the master's hand and thanks him for making her mom healthy again. Master Faraz talks about how it is his duty. At this time, the protagonist asks the captain if it is true that Faraz is a good doctor to his patients. Zared tells her that even though Faraz was unfair to the protagonist, but the master really cares about his patients, and he never refuses those who need help. At this point, Zared suggests the girl to cook something tastier than oatmeal. After some time, the protagonist and Zared are in the garden. They are sitting under a tree. The protagonist asks, Is Zared really the captain of the royal guard? She asks, how did the guy get injured then? Zared replies that it confuses him a bit, but when he was returning from a patrol, he was ambushed by bandits. Reina realizes that sounds like a dangerous job, but at least Zared has recovered. But at that moment, the protagonist thinks about the guy Urges she's treating. Zared asks why he shouldn't give the protagonist a tour of the palace. After all, he still needs to visit the armory and the stables. The protagonist agrees. After a while, they find themselves in the armory. Zared is holding a sword. The protagonist says that the sword looks very heavy. Zared suggests that the girl try to support it. Reina picked up the sword, and she can barely hold it with her 2 hands. Zared starts laughing, and he decides to show the girl how to hold the sword properly. Reina thinks her hands are more suited for smaller objects. Zared says that's probably true, but the girl's hands are still talented. He offers to look at the local stables as well. At this time, the main character's boyfriend is already in the stables. Reina is grateful that Zared came for her. After all, he is very kind, and the girl is glad that she now has such a friend. Suddenly, Reina notices that the prince is sitting under a tree in the distance. He is asleep. The protagonist is surprised because it seems that the prince has a lot of free time. Zared says there's more to see, things to see. He suggests the girl go. Suddenly, Captain Zared begins to hear someone calling. It's the wars. Zared asks what it means. They tell him that by royal decree. They were ordered to escort Mr. Wren to Lazarus immediately. After all, Urgis's condition has changed. They want the protagonist to go along with them. After a while, they are already entering the palace. The protagonist cannot understand what happened to the guy. She hopes that it's nothing serious. At that moment, His Highness is approached by the guy who escorted the protagonist out and says, "They brought Mr. Wren as His Highness had ordered." His Highness thanks the guys and says that he can go. Reina doesn't understand what's going on. She asks if she can find out about the guy's condition. She asks what's wrong with him. But at this point, Urges turns out to be very cheerful. He greets the protagonist and says that he is fine. Reina approaches the guy and talks about how he thought something bad happened. Wren is glad the guy is okay. Urges says he's fine and his dad must have overdone the urgency. Ralph talks about how Urges finally regained consciousness today after days of regaining consciousness and losing it again. Father wanted to inform His Highness. At this point, Reina turns to the boy and asks if she can look at his wound. Reina offers to let her see if it is healing well. Urges agrees. After examining it, the protagonist says that the wound is healing very well. At this point, Master Faraz speaks angrily about it unsurprisingly. The father asks the master, "Didn't he see the appendix taken out?" After all, it is a revolutionary procedure. He asks who knew that this appendix could ruin so many patients. The prince asks if that's what the medical academy teaches. The master says not that he knew about it, but Ralph tells His Highness that he is sure no one has ever studied this kind of thing before. He turns to the protagonist and says that he dares to ask if Wren will agree to share her surgical technique, because Ralph thinks that this information needs to be shared with the entire medical community. Wren replies that it's not really her technique, but her late master's. The protagonist thinks that's a good excuse, and she certainly can't attribute it to herself. The prince asks, "Was it really Wren who learned from the master and nowhere else?" Wren tells His Highness that he is sorry, but the master wished to remain anonymous after his death. Ralph asks if the girl thinks that the master was kind enough to pass the technique on to him. Wren replies that of course he does, and he thinks that the master would be pleased to know that his knowledge has spread, as long as his name is not given to the technique. Mentally, the girl thanks Dr. Charles McBarry for creating the incision for the appendectomy. At this point, the prince turns to Mr. Ralph and he asks, does his opinion mean that their palace physician, Master Faraz, is incompetent compared to this commoner? Ralph begins to apologize to His Highness, but he didn't mean to belittle Faraz's abilities at all. The prince turns to the Danish master, talking about his work in the palace. For years now, he asks, doesn't Faraz know anything about appendicitis? The prince has praised the master in the past, but now his knowledge won't even compete with that of a healer from the village. He asks, perhaps he should replace the master with this guy. Reina is watching all this, and she realizes that this is definitely not what she wanted. Master Faraz appeals to His Highness and asks the prince to come to his senses. After all, the boy's late teacher is clearly an unusual man. and such knowledge is not even available in the capital. Not only does he lack these skills, but so does everyone else. The prince says that the master has many faults, and he is not the kind of man to tolerate incompetence. The royal healer is responsible for the well-being of everyone in the palace, and the prince can't trust their lives into untenable hands. Reina thinks about the fact that she doesn't know if she can intervene, but Master Faraz doesn't deserve to be treated this way. She remembers how the master helped a woman he was thanked by a small also. The master was very kind to this girl. Reina decides to go to His Highness and apologize because she thinks Master Faraz is a great doctor in his own right. He may not have known the technique that saved Ira, but that doesn't diminish his competence in other areas. Suddenly, Zared intervenes in the conversation and addresses His Highness and says that he agrees with what Ren said. After all, perhaps instead of replacing the royal physician, the prince could make Ren his personal physician. Reina enters puzzled. She realizes this is a bad idea, but she can't understand why Zared chooses this for her. After all, she thought Zared was her friend too. But Zared gestures for Reina not to worry because it's the perfect plan. Zared says that maybe with Ren's knowledge, he can cure the prince of the mysterious illness that has been plaguing him for the past few months. Reina can't understand what the captain is talking about. The prince replies that the captain is talking nonsense, but still, sometimes there is a thought in his words. Zared says that he is trying his best. At this point, the prince agrees. Suddenly, Master Faraz approaches His Highness and says that he is grateful that the prince has turned a blind eye to his incompetence, and the master promises that it won't happen again. At this point, the prince turns around and walks away. Reina doesn't understand. Is that really all the prince said? She doesn't realize who she is. After all, until now the girl does not know how she ended up in this world. She wonders to herself if she might become the prince's personal physician. Master Faraz is getting angry. He doesn't know who he thinks he is. That boy. When the protagonist and Zared were walking down the corridor, they are approached by a boy who apologizes about Mr. Ren, but he was told to inform the doctor about his new place of residence. Reina couldn't understand. She asks, "What new place of residence?" The protagonist is asked to investigate after the guy in her rest. Since she didn't bring any clothes and things with her, they have prepared some outfits for her in the closet, and also her bag is already moved too. The boy says that His Highness mentioned that the physician was appointed as his personal physician, so they decided that the room next to His Highness's chambers would be best for her. When the doors to the protagonist's new quarters opened, Reina couldn't believe where she was. At that moment, Zared turns to Ren and tells her that he's on his way out, and the boy can get some rest. At this point, the servant hopes the doctor's rest will come to his liking. He says Mr. Ren can call him if he needs any help. Reina thinks about how she has never had such a large, luxurious room before. Suddenly, she notices some kind of strange door. Reina decides to walk towards it, but suddenly she notices that the prince is in there and he is in the process of changing his clothes. At that moment, Reina sharply closes the door. She doesn't realize. Is this really reality? Reina doesn't realize. Does she have to open the door again to find out? But at that moment, the prince says he didn't call the doctor. Reina apologizes. She says she didn't know their rooms were next door. Suddenly, the prince tells Reina to open the door. The prince says there is no need to shout through the door. He asks, "Does he really look that intimidating?" But Reina says His Highness doesn't look intimidating, and he sees a shirtless man in the mirror every day. At this point, the prince starts laughing. After a moment, the prince says he'll call a doctor when he needs one, and Ren doesn't need to shake him like a bird over her eggs, and the symptoms aren't severe yet. Ren says if he needs anything, he can call him. But the prince replies that he doesn't have time to examine him. At this point, the prince turns away. Reina thinks that this prince is upright and man is he in pain, but he doesn't accept help, and Reina turns to His Highness and talks about the fact that since he is a prince, their subjects are counting on him as a leader, and a prince can't be a good leader if he is in poor health. At this point, the prince turns and says that Ren is free to go. Ren apologizes for being too direct, but a doctor has to be honest with his patients and himself. The prince agrees and talks about that he will go for an examination as soon as he has time, and now the doctor can go. The protagonist agrees with the prince and closes the doors. When Reina closed the doors, she threw herself on her bed. She doesn't realize what a stubborn prince. After some time, the protagonist went out to the garden for a walk, and suddenly she noticed a woman. She turned to her and asked for forgiveness. But at that moment, the girl was frightened and dropped the book she was holding in her hands. Reina picked up the girl's book and apologized because she didn't mean to scare her. At that moment, when the protagonist took the book in her hands, she saw that it was a love book. But suddenly, the girl snatched the book from the protagonist's hands. At this moment, Ren turns around and talks about what he wanted to say, that the girl's cat is very cute. Unexpectedly, the girl suggests that the protagonist should be friends from now on. The next morning, Reina wakes up and starts yelling that she has a scheduled surgery in an hour. She asks where her hala is. But suddenly she realizes that she is no longer in her world. She asks, "Has it really only been a few days?" The girl doesn't understand how she's supposed to return to her home world, and if she has to live here for the rest of her life. She begins to feel angry that she will never find her way home. But for now, she will make the best of the situation, because there are still those who need her help. Suddenly, someone knocks on the main character's room. It turns out to be the same blonde-haired girl whom the protagonist met yesterday in the garden. The girl asks if Ren is up yet. When the protagonist hears the girl's voice, suddenly she starts to get ready to change into a man. She asked the girl to wait for a few seconds. When the protagonist came out, she was already changed. She asked what the girl needed. The girl said that she knows the doctor has a bad relationship with her older brother, so she can help him. At this point, the girl grabs Reina's hand and starts pulling her along. Reina asks the girl who is her older brother. After a while, they get to a room and the girl closes the doors, and there stands the prince. Reina doesn't understand. Is it really her elder brother? It's the prince. But a girl named Vanya is the complete opposite of her brother. The protagonist doesn't understand how a cold man can have a benevolent sister. At this point, Vanya starts screaming and asking her brother why he hasn't been examined by Mr. Ren yet. She asks, doesn't he need to be examined until the pain gets worse? At this point, the prince is grateful for his sister's concern, but he doesn't have time for that right now. Vanya yells for the prince to make time for it. At this point, the prince turns to the protagonist to ask if Ren has received the medical devices that he ordered for him. Ren replies that he has. All that is needed, he thanks His Highness. They are just in his room and he will take them now and come back. As the protagonist closed the doors to the prince's room, suddenly Zared appears in front of her. Zared apologizes for getting in the girl's way. Reina also apologizes because she didn't know that Zared was standing behind the doors. Talks about how she'll be right back. At this point, the captain walks into the prince's room and His Highness asks, "Is something wrong?" The princess greets the captain. The captain apologizes for interrupting, but he says that a meeting with the townsfolk is about to begin. The prince turns to his sister and talks about how he already has to go. But the princess tries to hold her brother back and talks about how Damien can't do that. The prince turns to his sister and talks about how this is about the safety of their capital and he needs to go. Vanya tries to stop her brother, but she fails miserably. She begs for Ren to examine her clueless brother. The prince asks who the sister called stupid, but at this point Damien agrees and tells Ren to do it as soon as possible. The prince takes off his shirt and he lies down on his bed for the doctor to examine him. Reina asks if she can find out from His Highness where his pain is. At this point, the prince points to the right side of his stomach and talks about that after eating he experiences pain in that place. However, such cases are rare. Reina makes an examination and realizes that there is nothing wrong with the prince's heart or lungs, but the pain is only in the upper right area. Unexpectedly, the prince asks if the doctor has finished his examination. The protagonist turns to His Highness and talks about what she still needs to ask the prince a few questions and feel his abdomen to truly assess his condition. But the prince rises from his seat and he says he has many important things to do. The sister tries to stop her brother, but Damien talks about how he will call the doctor when he needs him, and right now, people need him. Prince turns around and leaves. At this point, Zared apologizes to the protagonist prince, and Zared turn around and leave. Vanya turns to Ren, and she's really sorry about her brother's behavior, but Damien never took care of his health, and the princess thought it was the perfect opportunity to give him a thorough checkup, but he's always busy. Ren says it's fine and the princess doesn't need to apologize for her big brother. After all, he's just glad he was able to give him a little checkup. The princess is glad, but hopefully they'll get more opportunities like this. Vanya talks about how her brother is a real workaholic. Vanya suggests the protagonist check on the prince in the evening to see if he's sleeping well, and then Ren can say that it was the princess who gave that order. Reina realizes that if the prince's illness is what she thinks it is, then they need to act as soon as possible. Reina walks around the castle and she starts to get angry. The girl says it's driving her crazy. She doesn't understand how she can find someone in this huge castle if she gets lost every 5 minutes. After all, the girl lost her cell phone, and she's surrounded by unfamiliar faces, and her only patient here almost won't let her near him. Reina remembers the night she went to His Highness and told him that Princess Vanya was worried about his health. Reina asked for the prince to get some rest. Seeing the prince like that, the protagonist remembers herself when she was in medical school and practiced all night long. But back then, she had no one to look after her. And the prince doesn't know how lucky he is to have people who care about him. And the least she can do is make sure the prince doesn't work himself to death. Reina talks about how she's gonna need better tools and equipment. Suddenly, the protagonist notices that the knights are now jousting on swords. The girl thinks about the fact that she needs to find weapons. Reina thinks that Masha is too busy to accompany her. Reina sees that Zared is busy there as well. She realizes that the guy has clearly defined rectus abdominis and oblique abdominal muscles. Zared and Damien look quite healthy at first glance, but this proves that they can never know the patient's health without examining him. At this moment, Reina is observing the guy. Zared turns his attention to the girl, and at this moment the captain asks if he is all right. Zared puts his weapon away and tells the knights to practice what he told them with their peers. At this time, the captain approaches the protagonist asking if the girl needs help. Ren apologizes for interrupting the guy's training. He just wanted to know if there was a forge in the palace, so he could make surgical instruments. Zared agrees to accompany the protagonist because he knows the blacksmith well. After a while, they arrive at their destination. Zared knocks on the door and asks if James is here. At that moment, the blacksmith opens the door and greets Zared. He apologizes for the smoke coming from his forge. After all, they came in while he was baking. Reina doesn't understand. Does this blacksmith really dog the swords? The blacksmith sees that Newface is in front of him. He asks what the main character's name is. Reina introduces herself and says her name is Ren. The blacksmith says it's wonderful since he just baked some muffins, and he can't say they're as good as his swords. Reina walks into his forge, and she is incredibly surprised. She wonders if the blacksmith can make medical devices. At that moment, the blacksmith takes his muffins and talks about how maybe he left them on too long, and they're a little burnt. He suggests that the guests take some, but Zared and Reina refuse. The blacksmith gets incredibly upset and Reina decides just to taste what they taste like. Zared asks if Ren is sure, but Reina realizes it's nothing. After all, Zared didn't see the main character cook when she first started school. When Reina tries it, she says that it's actually quite delicious. The blacksmith is incredibly happy that the guy liked it since he used his secret ingredient. Reina doesn't understand. Could it really be soot? But the blacksmith says that they probably want something from him anyway. Ren talks about how he was recently appointed as the prince's personal physician and he needs surgical tools. Reina says that the blacksmith is very good at making weapons. The protagonist asks if she can hope that the blacksmith could make some tools for her. The blacksmith says he's pleased that Reina thinks so highly of him, but creating medical tools, it's not his specialty. The blacksmith says that Ren can't trust him with such important tools. There are also many talented artisans in the capital who would do it better than him. At this point, Zared tells the blacksmith to be more confident. After all, he hasn't even seen the tools the doctor needs yet. Zared asks if Ren could draw the tools he needs so James can take a look. The protagonist walks over to the table, and she sees that there are goose quills. She doesn't understand how to even use it, but she realizes that it's a good thing that the surgical instruments have already become an extension of her hand. Reina never thought that the day would come when she would be responsible for making her own instruments. Zared can tell they look a lot simpler than the swords Kuznetsov made. At this point, Reina shows a drawing of her tools. The blacksmith says that maybe the captain is right, and he thought these surgical items would look like amputation saws. But the blacksmith is happy to say that he can lend. The doctor some of his talent. The blacksmith talks about how he will do his best. The protagonist thanks the blacksmith, but she thinks about the fact that now she has to gather the medicine she needs and somehow get personal protective equipment. Zared thinks that Reina has settled in well, but she doesn't know what she will have to face. After some time, the protagonist and Zared come to see the manager of the royal pharmacy. They go into his office and he greets Captain Zared incredibly. He asks what Zared is sick with today. At this point, Zared approaches the manager, whose name is Albie, and Zared asks that Albie refrain from making such jokes in front of the new guy. Albie sees that this guy must be the prince's new personal physician, Mr. Wren. Albie talks about that he's the manager of the royal pharmacy ready for the guy's services. He asks that Wren call him by his first name, Anna. Wren says it's a pleasure to meet him, and he tells Albie to call him by his first name, Wren. Albie asks, "How did Dr. Wren get here?" The protagonist replies that since he is new to the palace, it would be good for him to familiarize himself with the medicines here. Albie tells him they have just about everything: cilantro, wormwood, mint, bitters, myrrh. Albie says that if Wren is talking about the newest and most expensive drug, it's the latest medical invention of the High Priest. At this point, Albie pulls out a small chest and says that it has miraculous healing powers and has greatly reduced the death rate among their knights. It is called penicillin. Reina asks, "How does it work?" But Albie says he has no idea because he's just a salesman. But what Reina wants to know has to do with curious witch gossip. Reina remembers that Zared also mentioned the witch. At this point, Zared asks that Albie tell them more specifically. Anna says it's just a rumor from 50 years ago. It's gossip too small to discuss. Wren talks about how he comes from a distant village and he has never heard of this witch. Anna agrees to tell this greatest gossip of the century. Albie would be ignorant not to enlighten this guy. Albie is willing to tell in brief that the witch was a legendary doctor with marvelous healing powers, who cared for everyone and asked for nothing in return. She was beloved by many, but the church condemned her as a heresy and a witch. The knowledge she possessed was too great. Reina asks, "Was it then that all women doctors were condemned as heresy?" She asked, "What happened to the witch?" Albie replies that unfortunately the witch has disappeared. Reina asks, "Did the church kill her?" But she doesn't know that. He asks what Reina thinks. Suddenly, Master Faraz walks in on them. Albie greets Master Danny and asks how he can help him. Faraz tells him that he has a patient with a frozen pus inflammation in his leg. He asks that Albie prepare ingredients for him. For a topical ointment, there should be wine, onions, and ox stings. Reina thinks about what she has heard of this ointment before. It was used for diseases in the Middle Ages, and recently research has shown that it actually has some antibacterial properties, but purulent inflammations can't be treated with antibiotics alone, because if it's not drained properly, the pus will continue to grow until it bursts, and then the infection becomes more serious. At this point, Reina goes to the master and asks if the pus has already been removed. But Faraz replies that it's not the guy's concern. Reina says that if the pus is congealed and won't drain on its own, then the master should open it up and dry it. Reina asks if Master Faraz understood the nature of the inflammation, because if the master doesn't dry it, the pus will burst, causing the wound to worsen. And after removing the pus covering the wound, the patient should also be treated with penicillin. To avoid further complications, Faraz asks, "Does the guy dare to tell him how to treat his patient?" Rain turns to the master and says that he didn't mean to insult him, but the master should keep in mind that he is giving him advice based only on his experience. And Reina trusts that he fellow doctor will understand him. But at this point, Faraz starts to get angry and talks about how Ren is insolent. Zared tries to stop the master and asks him to think over his words. After all, insulting their Highness's personal physician, it is an insult to himself. At this time, Albie has already prepared what Master Faraz asked him to prepare. At this point, Faraz asks that Albie put penicillin with him as well. Faraz takes what he needs. He turns around and leaves. Reina thinks about how the foreman seems to be thinking her words. Reina thanks the pharmacy manager for his time because of the information. Albie says that Ren can stop by any time as he passes by. After a while, the protagonist and Zared walk down the hallway. She thanks the captain for always supporting her. But Zared replies that it's no problem because he is somewhat responsible for the situation the girl is in. He was intrigued. And Reina asks why Zared decided to help her. She doesn't understand. Why Zared brought her to this place? Because if women doctors are seen as heresy. She asks if Zared won't get punished for hiding her. Zared agrees to explain. To the girl. Because ever since the witches disappeared, medicine has been on the wane. All women doctors have come to be considered heresy and unworthy of their knowledge. And those living in the Nishtaten could afford more of the church's medical expenses. These were and still are hard times. It's the reason the city guard demanded a meeting with the prince to discuss the citizens' problems, at least the most pressing of them. Zared talks about how he was born an ordinary man, not in a noble family, and meeting the protagonist gave him hope that somewhere in the distance, the knowledge of medicine continues beyond the church. Zared knows it was wrong of him to take it up with Ren, but Zared is hopeful that Ren can bring her incredible knowledge to the people of this kingdom, and he sees a small change that Reina has already had a hand in. Zared talks about having selfish thoughts as well. There's always a strained relationship between the church and the regular family, and neither of them wants to upset the delicate balance. But Damien is different. He is a prince to the people. Also, Damien is best friends with Captain Zared brought the girl to the castle since he believes that if anyone could heal him, it would only be Reina. Zared asks if Reina can forgive him for the burden he called on her, but Reina replies that it's not a burden that Zared has placed on her, and it's none other than the oath she took when she became a doctor, and Reina will never let anyone's life go to waste. From what Reina had seen, Reina concluded that people in this world had no idea about microbial theory, but that doesn't matter without the proper equipment, because every surgical procedure, with a high risk of complications and infection. The protagonist hopes that when working with the prince will not be a problem considering that he is quite stubborn. At that moment, a servant appears on the girl's way, saying that His Highness Prince Damien can receive the doctor now. Reina arrives at the prince's office. Damien asks, "Is there something Reina needs?" His Highness and apologizes, for he has a request for the prince. He asks if the prince can find him a tailor to make him a medical uniform. The prince asks if Reina has been to the palace tailor. Reina replies that he has, but the tailor's tailoring is not up to par. The prince asks, "What kind of medical uniform is so difficult to make?" He asks, "Does one have to wear special clothes during surgery?" Reina says that it is, after all. Surgical uniforms worn by doctors protect not only them, but also the patient from carrying infection and bacteria, also pests, and ensures a better environment conducive to the patient's recovery. The prince asks, "Is that really so?" because he's never heard that idea before, and he asks, "Does his late teacher's research really contain such a conclusion?" Reina says it does. There are organisms in the water and in the dust that are the root cause of disease, and they may be invisible to the naked eye, but very dangerous. The prince asks, "Are these really the same organisms that cause festering wounds and prevent healing?" Reina replies that they are. The girl is surprised. Damien takes her words seriously, and this time the prince is determined. The prince says that he wants to see how this kind of surgery works, for interest's sake, if it's so effective. As Ren says, then maybe they will standardize the conditions of the surgeries as recommended by Dr. Ren, not only in the palace, but in the entire kingdom. Reina is incredibly pleased and thanks His Highness. After all, the prince will be the first to see the uniform once it is ready. The prince will give Ren permission to leave for the capital, and then he can go wherever he wants. The prince trusts that Ren will faithfully follow his teacher's instructions. The girl thanks the prince for such a thing. At that moment, suddenly Vanya enters the prince's room. She heard about the trip to the capital. He says that Vanya has reappeared at just the right time. Vanya replies that it is her talents that he is getting better every year. The princess talks about going to the capital with Ren, and she is sure that mom and dad won't give birth to you if the prince lets her go. The prince asks, since when does Vanya ask his permission? Vanya grabs Ren's hand and says from now on. She starts coaxing her big dear brother. After all, her effeminately beautiful, intelligent, and wonderful brother should let her go. In what sense he is effeminately handsome? At this point, Zared walks into the prince's office. He has a stack of paper and he addresses the prince. Zared says he has more papers for the prince to look at. The prince starts to get angry and asks why his room is turned into a fairground. But Zared asks that the prince not look at him. so after all, he's just doing his job. Since Damien is next in line for the throne, His Majesty Piolisteo has to make sure of the prince's experience, and that includes paperwork. The prince says that his father was always the captain's priority over him, even when Zared was his personal guard. Vanya turns to her brother and asks, "Doesn't Damien remember how he always got Zared into trouble?" After all, it's obvious that Zared would rather listen to his father. Besides, father gives the captain his paycheck, not the prince. Vanya turns to Ren and talks about how Ren didn't know about it, but Masha started out as Damien's nanny, or rather, he was his guard. And Ren won't believe it. The antics the captain had to put up with because of her brother. Zared talks about the past, he remembers. One time when they were 13 years old. And one night, the prince invited him to his room and ordered him to run away from the palace with him. Vanya remembers this situation too. After all, her brother had some kind of stomach illness. Well, Vanya teased incessantly that Damien would soon go under Master Faraz's knife. The prince was very afraid of that at the time. And Zared says, so instead of treatment, the prince chose to run away while everyone else slept. Zared was terrified that if he refused, the prince would fire him, but if Zared went with him, he would be punished for helping the prince. Vanya says that her brother was such a tyrant. The prince gets angry and talks about how they can stop discussing this because back then, he was a child. Zared thinks about the fact that the prince is still getting physicals as a child. Vanya says that after that, her brother started reading medical books to avoid misunderstandings in the future and watched his health. Though the princess thinks that her brother just wants to avoid medical checkups and scalpel. Vanya says her brother is a little afraid of them. Damien says he can still hear his sister. Reina thinks that the prince of reading medical books doesn't want to go through the exams, and that's very surprising. After all, there must be another way to get through it. And then Reina can finish, diagnosing the prince. At this point, Vanya puts her arm around the protagonist and turns to her brother. Because, as she said earlier, she asks Damien to let her go to the capital with Ren. At this moment, the prince requests that Vanya stay away from men and doctors included, but Vanya replies that the prince is just jealous of her because she will be spending time with Ren and the prince will not. Reina turns to His Highness and says that if Damien wants to spend time with her, he could just call her to check on his health. Vanya also agrees that the prince should let the doctor examine him, but the prince says that's a definite no. Vanya says that if that's the case, then she has no objection to giving Ren a date. She means in the capital, and they can take the captain with them too. The prince realizes that if Zared accompanies them, then it's okay. He tells them to make sure they try not to get into trouble. Vanya agrees and she starts to get incredibly excited. Reina thinks about everyone watching this as she creates the love triangle of the century, and Damien is already jealous that she's hanging out with Ren. At this point, the prince calls the doctor and tells him that if he finds out that Ren looked at his sister from the wrong angle, he will kill him. Ren assures His Highness that will not happen. Ren asks if the prince can promise to let him examine the prince as soon as they return. But the prince replies that the doctor should not insist on it. After a while, they are on their way. The prince is watching them from the window. After a while, they are already in the carriage. And Vanya says that she has never been to the capital before. Because of her brother's boredom, it is difficult for her to leave the palace. Zared says that Damien's concern will prove to be unnecessary. However, it is because of his love for his sister. Suddenly, the carriage slowed down, and Reina could have fallen on the captain, but Zared held her back. At that moment, Reina apologized, but the captain said it was okay. After a while, they had already arrived at the capital. The captain got out of the carriage first, and he gave his hand to the princess. Following that, he gives his hand to the protagonist. Reina starts to get angry and realizes that men do not give hands to each other. Vanya suggests, before finding a tailor to take a walk. Zared says that if they don't mind, he will stop by the store since his younger sister is getting married, and he should find a good wedding gift for her. Vanya says that Zared is gorgeous. After all, any girl or guy would be with him. Zared says that even so, the prince's fleeting bride will be much luckier. Reina asks in surprise, doesn't Damien still have a fiancé? But at that moment, Vanya and Zared start laughing. Vanya says her brother is picky about food and clothes, but not about people. Zared says that of course Damien will have to pick someone up eventually, but at least until the king wants to marry his children. The main character laughs too, since the prince is always so busy, and she's not surprised. Vanya talks about how Ren can blame her brother for being such a bachelor. Zared suggests that everyone go into the store already. They are greeted by a saleswoman. She asks how the princess likes their new line of cat jewelry. Vanya talks about how wonderful it is she can't even resist. Reina walks over to one piece of jewelry, talking about how she's not the best jeweler. But this necklace is amazing. Zared approaches the girl and talks about how this necklace would look good on her. Reina says that he hasn't worn any jewelry like that himself, but he can help find something for his sister. They start looking at different items, and Zared says that his sister has always wanted a sapphire brooch. He's sure she'll love it. At that moment, Reina pulls out a bag of gold, and Zared asks if Ren is sure he doesn't want to buy something for himself. But Reina says that the money she has now is not hers. It was given to her by the prince, so she can't do that. Zared asks, "Didn't Damien tell him it was his daily allowance?" The royal family has their own account at the store, meaning Reina can buy everything here in Damien's name. Reina doesn't understand. She's really rich. After all, she could use this money to pay off her debt to the medical school. When they leave the store, Vanya says they should head to the tailor. Reina wants to find the best one. After a while, Reina is incredibly upset. She talks about how none of the tailors they went into are suitable. She asks if they can go deeper into the city. Zared says that's a good idea, but he doesn't see where there would be a better place to start. At this point, Vanya thinks about the fact that her brother has never let her go that far before, so she heads off to the dark place. Suddenly, they notice there a homeless man. Reina tries to help him, but at that moment, Zared grabs the girl by the arm and says that this place is not for princesses. Reina just rejoices in her wealth. But the child is sitting here hungry and cold. Reina doesn't even realize how many sick people there are in this world who have no way to heal. The protagonist breaks free from the captain's arms, and she approaches the child. She takes the kid's hand and talks about all she can do for him now. She tells the kid to wait for her. She gives him some gold coins, and they turn around and walk away. Vanya asks how Ren is feeling. Ren replies that he is fine. After a while, they come to a building where the tailor is located. Reina realizes that there is a job for her, and she has to do it. They walk into the tailor's and see an incredible store there. Reina sees that this store is modern. At that moment, they are greeted by a girl in her humble store. She says her name is City. The girl asks what she can do for her. At this point, Ren says that he would like to know if the girl can sew a particular outfit for him. City replies that of course she will try to do so. Reina tries to explain that she is a doctor, so she needs surgical gowns, as well as masks and hats. The gowns need to be long-sleeved with ties in the back and the masks. City tells the guy not to speak. Not a word more, she will be right back. Vanya starts getting angry and asks, "Did this girl just interrupt the doctor and leave?" At this moment, a dog appears in front of them. Ren didn't think that finding a tailor would be so difficult, but at least her dog is very beautiful. Suddenly, the dog starts crying. Reina asks what's wrong. At that moment, City appears and talks about how he has always been emotional. The girl holds out the sketches to the doctor and asks him to take a look. Reina realizes it's perfect. She barely described the design, and these sketches already look ready for modern production. Reina doesn't realize if this woman could have been from her Earth. City asks, "Is that what the doctor wanted?" Reina replies that it's amazing. Zared always envisioned it differently. After all, Zared pictured it as knight armor. Reina thinks about how Zared seems to love his job. Ren turns to the tailor and talks about how he needs 5 of these. He asks if the girl could deliver them to the royal palace. Reina asks when they will be ready. City replies that it's no problem, but she asks for his measurements first. City says not to let the guests be shy and they can look for now. After all, no one knows if the princess might like something. Vanya agrees. She says she would do it with pleasure. Reina is surprised because the clothes look very modern. Reina thinks that if she can somehow travel to this world, then there is a chance that others can too. At that moment, City says that she has already finished the fitting. Vanya turns to the doctor and talks about how honestly, these dresses would fit him perfectly. Ren starts laughing and talks about how he would consider it a compliment. But Zared gets angry and asks what Vanya is saying because Ren is a guy and it wouldn't suit him. Zared suggests the protagonist to wear men's clothes. Vanya starts getting angry and yells at the captain after all men can wear dresses too. Zarad asks, should he really wear a dress then? Vanya replies that perhaps he should. Vanya turns to Madame Lisa, saying that she wants to buy everything. Vanya asks that the girl write it down about the royal family and take it to the palace. Siti speaks of being quite grateful and will send them to the palace, everything including the surgical clothes in 3 weeks. The princess thanks the tailor and talks about how wonderful it would be. As the protagonist is passing by an alley, she sees something in the guy is no longer in that spot, and Reina hopes that the guy was able to buy himself some food and medicine. Suddenly, the protagonist starts calling for the captain. Reina turns around and asks, what was Zarad trying to say? But Zarad says that he said that foreign traders are coming to the castle soon, they need to hurry back. Vanya tells them that there will be incredible and delicious ingredients from all over the world, and Ren can miss it. Ren replies that they say food is the best medicine. After a while, they head to the market, and Reina talks about how she has never seen anything like it. At that moment, they hear some kind of argument. Reina turns to the princess and asks if her brother is there. At this point, Damien asks the vendor what he just said, but the vendor repeats that he doesn't sell to peasants. After all, if they can't afford it, it's not his problem. Vanya sees that this promises to be interesting. At that moment, a guy stands up for the prince and tells the merchant to watch his language. He asks if the merchant realizes that he is talking to His Highness, but the merchant replies that he's not being disrespectful to His Highness. He just can't stand the insolence of these people. The men begin to apologize. They ask if Sir could sell them a cure for their stomach pains for 2 pieces of silver. After all, his wife is sick, and he can only offer him this based on his income. But the peddler replied that he could not buy even the smallest vial for 2 silver. He told the men to leave. The merchant turns to His Highness and says that the peasants will not be able to afford these medicines anyway, because even the cheapest vials in the church cost 1 gold. He asks if he can look at the vials of medicine he's selling. The merchant replies that the prince can do so. And at that moment, he hands 1 vial of medicine to His Highness. Damien asks, is the peddler saying that this medicine was made by the church? The peddler replies that it is. The prince says that the church's medicines are certainly of the highest quality, so they are priced accordingly. But occasionally there are daredevils who go so far as to create counterfeits and make a profit out of them, taking from the visitors their hard-earned money and not caring at all about their health. The prince says it's a despicable crime, but fortunately, the church has taken special measures to reduce the risk of counterfeit goods tarnishing its reputation. The prince asks if the merchant knows what those measures are. Each bottle is molded with the church's Lily of the Valley crest. At this point, the prince pulls up a bottle that does not have this crest. The peddler said he must have picked the wrong medicine, and the church ones were left in the warehouse. The peddler says these medicines were made by local herbalists, but they are still of quality, he assures His Highness. The prince asks where the vial of medicine for stomach pain is. The peddler holds out the vial of His Highness's medicine, and the prince tells the peddler to take this silver coin and give the medicine to the man next to him that is with him. The peddler denies it and says it is worth more than 1 coin. At this point, the prince by royal decree reduces the value of this bottle to 1 coin. And according to the Herbalists Association, 1 silver is the net price able to cover all ingredient costs, and it is the price at which a fair profit can be made. The prince asks, does the merchant want to challenge his edict that makes medicine available to all the people of this kingdom? The merchant replies that of course he doesn't want to. He says he was wrong, and holds out the medicine to the people. The people thank His Highness, and this one asks about the doctor. Isn't her take cool? Reina asks, is there really a royal decree that sets a maximum price for medicine? Zarad says that Damien monitors the prices of all merchants to make sure that goods are sold at an affordable price. The prince wants to eliminate cheaters and overpricing as much as possible. Reina thinks that this would be useful in her world as well. At this point, Vanya starts calling for her brother. The prince walks up to them. He asks if Ren has found a good tailor in the capital. Ren replies that they did. Vanya asks her brother, wasn't he going to show them everything in this place? Reina sees that the prince is in a good mood. Is in a good mood right now? Damien replies that he's a little busy right now. At this point, Zarad tells Damien not to worry, because he thinks they can have fun just by following him. After all, this is the first time Ren is seeing all these foreign merchants, and Zared is sure he'll enjoy it anyway. The prince says he's going to check out the merchants from the west, and apparently they sell plants called chili peppers. Vanya is surprised at such a strange name. She wonders about the sweet Leon. She asks if she can eat 3 whole ones at a time. Reina thinks to herself that she wouldn't want to see that. After a while, they approach, and Reina says for Zared to just look at those fresh peppers. Zared asks, hasn't Ren seen them before? Reina replies that her teacher was given some of these peppers by his foreign friend. Reina hates lying all the time. The seller talks about the buyer having a sharp eye, and it really is a hot chili pepper that gives any dish a new flavor. Asks how it's hot. The salesman says the lovely miss can try it herself, but the pepper is hot enough that one tiny bite will be enough. After all, it is very spicy. The girl pops the whole thing in front of her mouth, and Ren tries to stop the girl because he's not sure if she should do that. But after only a moment, the girl realizes how hot the pepper really is, and she feels her tongue burning. At this point, the prince and Damien hold out their swords to the vendor. The prince asks what the vendor fed his sister and how he dared to poison Princess Reina turns to his highness, and she assures them it wasn't me. For it is. What the merchant meant by saying it's spicy, it has a burning effect. Vanya turns to her brother and talks about how she felt better. She was just surprised. But in fact, she even liked it. At this point, Prince Damien puts away his swords, and the prince says that Vanya always makes him worry about his sister. Damien apologizes to the merchant for jumping to conclusions. The prince asks if there is anything they can do to make up for the incident. Reina is nice to see someone admit their mistakes, especially when it's done by the prince with the point of maybe Reina was being unfair. The merchant says he doesn't need anything, and he understands his highness's reaction. After all, chili pepper is a novelty in these parts, so they might not know what spicy means. The merchant asks permission to give his highness a gift in honor of receiving foreign traders. The merchant said to let his highness accept his humble gift, and it is crushed cocoa beans. Reina is incredibly surprised because it's chocolate. The merchant presents the prince with a whole sack of it. After a while, they continue walking through the market. Vanya turns to Ren and asks if he's seen this before. Because they smell something bitter and earthy. The princess approaches the bear. The prince says that Vanya is embarrassing their staff. Vanya apologizes. She runs up to the protagonist. She asks if Ren knows what these cocoa beans can be used for. Reina replies that she knows a few recipes. Reina tells her that cocoa beans can be used to make many delicious desserts. Vanya talks about how she would really like to try it. After all, it's even possible that her brother would be interested in it. The pickiest man in the kingdom, Damien never finishes his food. He's just like a child. The prince begins to thank his sister, but he asks if she could not complain about him in his presence. Damien talks about how they have a few things to do, so they will see each other later. Meanwhile, Reina is thinking, does the abs never finish their food? She realizes that's not good. After all, picky eating can be caused by a certain disease. Ren turns to the princess and asks how often Damien complains of stomach pains. After all, the prince was passed over about it earlier when we were examined by him. Vanya replies that she has never seen her brother complain, but he usually wrinkles his nose and leaves the food on his plate. In fact, he just doesn't seem to like it. Reina asks if Prince has ever had fever attacks of nausea or vomiting. Reina realizes that Prince also does not have jaundice. Vanya replies that there has been no such thing, and the prince only drinks on special occasions. Reina realizes that there is no sign that the prince has viral or alcoholic hepatitis. But it's for the best. Even if their treatment would be fairly simple, and in both cases, they go away on their own, if it's not too advanced. Since Damien's experiencing pain after meals. Another reason for this could be acute pancreatitis. However, the pain caused by acute pancreatitis is in the upper left side of the abdomen and radiates to the back. Damien, on the other hand, said he feels pain in the upper right side. But the most common cause of pancreatitis is due to gallstones. If they were on the ground, she could diagnose it by doing an ultrasound and taking a blood test. But since there's no technology here that can easily to confirm her assumption, all she can do now is continue to observe the prince's symptoms and try to make a diagnosis based on her guess, and hope that the prince will trust her more so she can examine him again. Vanya asks, "Is something wrong?" She asks what Reina thinks is the best thing to help her brother increase his appetite. Reina replies that even if Princess's brother has a bad appetite and we should eat well-balanced food in small portions. And it seems that Reina is the prince's doctor and his nutritionist. Milk is considered a nutritious drink. Plus, now they have cocoa beans. After a while, they walk into the palace. Reina says that if today's weather is gloomy and cold, hot chocolate will do just fine. Vanya is already looking forward to it. Reina recalls that she used to love to cook. But mostly she did it out of necessity, as she had no one to look after her, and she did everything for herself. But now she has someone to cook for, and it's a stubborn prince. Maybe a hot drink will melt his icy nature. The main character enters the kitchen. The princess wishes everyone good morning, asks what brings Her Highness to this place. They say this place is not for a member of the royal family. They can't have her shoes and dresses stained in soot. Vanya thanks them for their concern, but she says they shouldn't worry because she is fine. Vanya says she is here to introduce them to Mr. Ren because he is the prince's nemesis. Vanya says that they received bags of cocoa beans yesterday, and Ren shows them the recipe for a very tasty dessert called hot chocolate. The maids discuss that it sounds very scary. Vanya starts looking and asking, "Where are the cocoa beans located?" The maid replies that the bags are in the corner, and they wanted to experiment with it themselves. Ren says he has a little experience in making them. To make the chocolate taste better, you have to roast the cocoa beans before grinding them. The maid reaches out her hand to kakababam, but Ren stops her. Ren says that when the maids are cooking, they need to make sure their hands are hygienic. The maid asks what that means. Ren tells her that their hands can easily spread organisms that cause disease and illness. They must wash their hands thoroughly with soap that reduces the risk. That they and the people they serve will get sick from food that is prepared in unhygienic conditions. In response to the protagonist's words, the maid gets angry. After all, no one has ever gotten sick from their food cooked with unwashed hands. She asks, "Does the protagonist mean to say that they cause illness?" But the protagonist replies that she didn't mean that maids cause disease. After all, hand washing in itself is a good preventive measure and should be universally practiced, especially when preparing food for others. The maids start discussing. For indeed, once they all had a problem after eating, even the royal family. Vanya also remembers the incident very well. After all, Master Faraz determined that it was food poisoning, and Vanya hopes it will not happen again. Now the princess turns to the maids and asks why they should not listen to Mr. Ren's words if washing hands really helps to provide such situations. The protagonist is surprised because she's never seen Vanya so serious. But at this moment, she thinks about how Vanya reminds her of the prince. Vanya knows that they will all listen to what Ren has to say. And now she's asking for Ren to show the others how to make hot chocolate. The protagonist thanks the mistress for her help. After a while, Reina tells her how to make hot chocolate. They, together with the maids, start the preparation, and after some time, already hot chocolate was prepared. The maids take the glasses of hot chocolate in their hands, and they are incredibly surprised because it looks unlike anything else. They start singing to try the flavor, but when they smelled this incredible aroma and found out what the hot chocolate really tasted like, they were all surprised. After a while, Vanya and the protagonist go to the prince to bring him some hot chocolate too. Vanya is sure that her brother will like the drink. The prince is surprised to see a glass of this drink and asks again what it is called. Vanya excitedly replies that it is hot chocolate and she is already waiting for her brother. Tastes it. After the prince takes a sip of this drink, the protagonist asks if the prince liked it. Damien asks in surprise who made this hot chocolate. Vanya replies that it was Ren, and he is amazing. Now the prince is curious. He asks if Ren can make more hot chocolate. After all, it's quite filling. Also, the prince wonders if Ren knows any other recipes. The main character is also surprised. She doesn't realize that she's the prince's personal doctor or his personal chef. But Reina realizes that it's an extra opportunity. She tells the prince that she can make a suitable diet plan for him, but only if he allows her to give him another checkup. At the same moment, the prince agrees and takes off his shirt. He replies that then he has no choice. The protagonist is puzzled by this. She knows Damien is impatient, but she thinks that there is no need to take off his shirt. The prince lies down on the couch and tells Reina to do it, as an elderly person. Reina thinks about how this environment doesn't seem right to her. After a while, the protagonist begins to examine the prince. She asks the prince to inhale and exhale. She thinks that the symptoms are a significant increase in pain on inhalation, while pressing on the stomach bladder is absent. But the protagonist realizes that's not accurate. After all, it just means that further examinations are necessary. And so far, the prince's symptoms don't indicate the development of right rib pain, jaundice, and fever, which would mean developing cholangitis. So the prince's condition is not as severe as the protagonist feared, but it's still imperative to make sure he doesn't get worse. At this point, Vanya turns to the protagonist and asks if Ren has noticed anything. The healer replies that he has some idea, but he needs to keep a closer eye on the prince's condition. They'll need another checkup soon. The prince says he is against any surgery. Vanya is surprised to hear this. She asks, "Is surgery really necessary?" The prince replies that obviously his condition is not bad enough to make drastic decisions, and he'll be perfectly fine. Ren replies that perhaps he is now, but it is important to eat a strict diet and get plenty of rest. Otherwise, the prince's condition may worsen, and then they will have to take other measures. The protagonist thinks that maybe Damien will recover on his own just by following a strict diet, and surgery will be the last resort. After a while, they sit down at the table again. And Vanya tells her brother that in the kitchen, Ren explained to the cooks how to wash their hands. It's a revolution in the world of cooking. Vanya asks what Ren called those disease-causing organisms. And then Ren replies that those organisms are called germs or bacteria. Damien replies that Ren mentioned the name before he went to find a tailor. It's a topic still unfamiliar to him. The protagonist replies that it is then a topic unfamiliar to the entire kingdom. She turns to His Majesty and says that all people should know about germs. After all, proper sanitation could save lives. The protagonist looks down at her hands in embarrassment and says that perhaps she talks too much and it exceeds her duties as the prince's personal physician. But Damien replies that he understands. Reina is surprised. Doesn't Damien argue with her? Damien replies that perhaps the healer knows that spreading unknown knowledge to the people is not an easy task, especially without the blessing of the church. The protagonist does not agree with the prince's words. She says that they have to believe that people will want to understand it, and it is necessary to find out what would be the best way to convey this information to people. The prince, after listening to what the healer said to him, that he would discuss it with his father, and they can only act with his father's approval. Damien says that in that case, Ren is free to go. After all, the prince still has a few things to do. The protagonist says goodbye to the prince, and she will wait eagerly for a reply. When Reina is about to leave the room, she is stopped by the prince, and at the last moment he thanks the healer for the hot chocolate. 2 days later, the protagonist is summoned by the prince. When Reina entered the prince's office, Zared was there as well. Damien turns to Ren and replies that he talked to his father about the suggestions Ren made. And father realized that the theories about bacteria and germs should be known by the whole kingdom. But he didn't want to scare people with something they couldn't even see. So father asked for more evidence, because he wants to know what the current living conditions are, and the level of education of the citizens not only in the capital, but also in the villages. Since Damien is the one invested in this project, he will investigate. And Zared will go with him. Ren will also go with them. So Damien asks the protagonist to prepare for a week-long trip, and they leave tomorrow at dawn. The protagonist was incredibly surprised to hear that. But gathering her thoughts together, the protagonist disagrees with the prince's words. After all, Reina only recently said that the prince needs rest. And now the girl does not know when the prince will have time to rest. Now, the protagonist does not understand. Will she really live with the prince all week? After all, the most important thing is that now the prince did not find out that she is a girl. After a while, they were on their way to their carriage. The protagonist looked out the window and remembered that the prince had told the protagonist to go with him on the trip. So now she's with them and trying to take up as little space as possible so as not to annoy the prince. The prince looks at the protagonist and after a while announces that he wants to remind her of the purpose of the trip. After all, They're going to 2 neighboring villages to learn as much as they can about sanitary habits and how they affect the health of the locals. Before heading back to the castle, they will visit the capital and then maybe rest. The prince says they'll arrive at the first village tomorrow afternoon, so in the evening, they will set up camp. When the protagonist heard this in her heart, she cried. She didn't understand. It will really take a day and a half. The girl is sure that if they had cars, they would have gotten there long ago. At this point, Zared turns to the prince and the protagonist and says that the 2 of them can sleep and he can be on watch. The prince turns to the healer and tells Ren to get some sleep. Ren agrees to His Majesty's words. In her mind, the girl is thinking about how menacingly the prince has just addressed her. When Reina fell asleep, she didn't realize that she was sleeping on the prince's shoulder. After a while, the protagonist woke up, and sleepy protagonist said that she never knew what smells so good. But suddenly, the girl notices that she slept on the prince's shoulder. Now the heroine apologizes. But the prince replies that he doesn't need an apology. He's glad Ren didn't stain him with his drool. After a while, the prince orders the knights to chop wood. The prince also told Chief Li to light a fire and start preparing the ingredients. And the rest of us put down clean land and put up sticks. Suddenly, the protagonist appears and turns to His Highness and asks what she should do. But the prince replies that Ren should stay here and help with the cooking. He's too weak to chop wood. The protagonist goes to help the cook, and she thinks it's a good thing that Chef Li followed the sanitary recommendations that he and the prince had made especially for the castle. When it was already dark outside and the wood had been chopped, the protagonist, the knight Zared, and the prince sat down by the fire to eat dinner. The protagonist was thinking that her and the chief's beef stew tasted pretty good. Zared turns to the girl and talks about his first taste of what Ren has prepared. He says the beef stew tastes unbelievably good. She says she's been alone most of her life, so she had to learn how to cook. The prince asks, "Did Ren really live alone?" Ren replies that he's an orphan. Then the prince apologizes for his tactlessness, but Reina replies that it's okay because she's used to it. Zared wants to ask the protagonist what prompted her to study medicine, but she says that when she lived in an orphanage, she saw how sick the children were and that there was almost no one to take care of them. Reina says that she never knew what the children were sick with, and she felt useless. A doctor would come to see them, and some of her friends would die anyway. And then the protagonist thought that if she could recognize their symptoms ahead of time and get help in time, she could save their lives. That's why it's so important to pay attention to the symptoms to get treatment as soon as possible. That's why Ren keeps insisting on it for His Majesty. Zared starts laughing. After all, Damien just has a childhood trauma related to doctors, but the prince doesn't want to talk about it. Zared hopes Ren will understand. Damien gets angry and says there's no truth to it. He asks Zared to stop saying such things. The knight agrees with the prince's words. Sometime later, the knights come to the prince and ask for permission to swim in the lake nearby. They need to refresh themselves before tomorrow's journey. He allows the knights to go to the lake and tells them to go ahead, and they will follow them. The protagonist and Zared are visibly frightened. Reina doesn't understand. I'm going to have to wash with men. But after a while, they go to the lake. The protagonist is disappointed. She realizes she has no way to escape. But Zared says he has a plan. The protagonist hopes so. When Reina approached the lake, she noticed that all the knights were already swimming in the water. She was frightened. The prince turns to the boy and asks, "Isn't Ren used to swimming with someone?" Zared thinks they will only embarrass Ren. After all, he's very shy. Now Zared whispers to the prince that really Ren just doesn't want anyone to see his horrible scar on his back. Zared tells him that the boy has been beaten up before and that it was very traumatic for him. The main character listens to what Zared says. The girl has no choice but to disagree, but she's in a panic. She doesn't understand. Is this really the plan that Zared came up with? Now the prince is angry. He asks who dares to beat up the boy, but at this point Zared starts crying. He says that's why he doesn't think Ren should bathe with them. After all, Ren still hasn't forgotten the horrible scar memories. The prince turns to the protagonist and says that he is sorry and understands. The protagonist supports the idea that Zared suggested, so she says that her scar hurts again. Zared says it's lucky that there's a pond nearby where Zared could swim alone, so Zared asks if Damien would mind. The prince, of course, agrees. After all, the most important thing is that Ren be comfortable. He says the pond is in the west and Ren can swim there alone. But now that the protagonist is gone, the prince turns to the knight and asks Zered to tell him who beat his doctor. But Zered replies that the prince is very worried about his doctor. Zered asks, "Isn't that strange?" But when the prince hears this, he gets angry. The next morning, the protagonist wakes up and finds herself sleeping next to the knight and the prince, scared. She can't believe she's been here all night, worried if Damien has found out her secret. Suddenly, the prince wakes up too, which startled the protagonist. But she tried to contain her surprise. The prince asks, "Is something wrong?" But at that moment, Zered also wakes up. The prince suggests to eat before going out, to be. Perhaps they will arrive at the first village before sunset. After some time, they set off on their journey, and by sunset, they were already near the village. The village elder Bjorn greets His Majesty. The prince approaches the elder and tells all those who greet him to raise their heads. Although the prince has not arrived here officially, he says that there is no need for such formalities. Bjorn asks that the prince follow him, and the heroes enter the village. Reina looks around and notices how the village looks. It looks much cheaper than the capital. Bjorn takes the prince to a house. This house belongs to a guy. It's simple and small, so he apologizes for that. But the prince replies that the boy, no need to apologize. They're grateful for any accommodation. They go inside and sit at the table next to the elder. The prince asks permission to introduce the elder to the people who play a crucial role in this project. The prince said that sitting next to him is Zered, captain of the royal guard. And there's another guy. That's his personal grim name, Ren. When Bjorn heard from that Ren is a doctor, he was very surprised. He apologizes, but they really need a doctor right now. They have a local healer, but Bjorn is afraid that the healer doesn't know as much as the doctor from the capital. The protagonist asks, "Is something wrong?" Bjorn tells that some residents are suffering from fever and stomach aches. Their healer is at a loss. Some old men say it's all about witchcraft, and that scares people more than the symptoms. The prince replies that he understands why the villagers are so frightened. The idea of witchcraft is mystical and terrifying, but the prince asks permission to assure them that witchcraft has nothing to do with it. But now Ren insists he needs to see the patients. The protagonist already wants to help people as soon as possible. But Bjorn tells Mr. Ren to rest first. After all, they have come such a long way, and now they must be exhausted. Reina wants to help, but the prince intervenes. The prince asks, if there are those among the sick who are in critical condition. Bjorn replies that the sick can wait until tomorrow. After all, most of them are probably asleep. Now the prince turns to the healer and says that then they too must rest. He understands the eagerness Ren is showing, but an exhausted and sleep-deprived doctor won't do anyone any good. The prince says Ren can visit the people tomorrow. The protagonist agrees. And after a while, they enter the room where they will sleep that night. Suddenly, the protagonist notices that there's one big bed and a couch, and when Reina saw that, she said she'd sleep on the couch, because if Damien is on the bed, she wouldn't be able to sleep there. After a while, the main character fell asleep alone on the couch, and Damien and Zered slept side by side on the same bed. The prince tells the knight that this is a great idea, but Zered just smiles. He says that they often slept together when they were children. Damien replies that it was because they were children, and so they shouldn't do such a thing now. But they turn away from each other and decide that they should get some sleep, because tomorrow will be a hard day. When the dawn came and the rays of the sun were already creeping into the room where the heroes were sleeping, it turned out that the prince had not slept all night. He was kept awake by Zered, who was always throwing his legs over parts of the bed where the prince was sleeping. The prince notices that Ren has long since left, and realizes that his doctor is a very hard worker. At this time, it turns out that the protagonist sent to help sick people. Alphonse is happy that Mr. Ren is here. The protagonist turns to the guy and asks to be called just by her first name. And she says that she is very glad that none of the people have any pronounced symptoms. Alphonse replies that that's rather odd, because different residents have come to him with the same symptoms. It's diarrhea, abdominal cramps, and a fever lasting about a week. The protagonist thinks about it and asks if it has happened before. Alphonse replies that it has happened before in misfortune, but they have never been able to find the cause. Ren replies that it's okay, they need to cure the sick first. Alphonse replies, that the healer is right, asks how they will work. Ren says they have to check for dehydration first. After all, if their patients' tongues aren't dry or their skin hasn't lost elasticity, the situation isn't that bad. Alphonse replies that they make sure people have the right amount of water. He asks what else needs to be done. Ren says that's a good start. After all, as everyone knows, fluid leaves the human body after every bout of diarrhea, so dehydration is logical. However, there is a much better solution than water. The main character says that you need to stir 6 teaspoons of sugar and half a teaspoon of salt in a liter of water. Only the water must be boiled. The healer tells the Alphonse to encourage his patients to drink a mug of this medicine after each symptom to help retain fluid in the body. Alphonse replies that he understands, and he thanks the doctor from the capital because he is incredible. Reina is embarrassed and says it's no big deal. But suddenly Zared appears behind her. Next to the knight stood and the prince, who asks why the protagonist is surprised. After all, they were shocked that Ren disappeared so early. Ren apologizes for not wanting to wake them up. Alphonse greets the prince and wishes him a good morning. He is a local doctor and his name is Alphonse. The prince wishes the guy a good morning as well, and he is glad to meet him. Zared turns to the protagonist and asks how everything is going. Ren replies that everything is fine. The patients are stable, nothing critical about their condition. Zared hears that. But Ren is worried about how these people got sick, because if it's not the first time, it's probably environmental. And the protagonist needs to get to the bottom of this as soon as possible. The prince agrees with the doctor. She and the knight will assess the sanitation of the village and start by disposing of the sewage waste. Suddenly, after these words, the protagonist cries out that she knows, for the problem may be colonization waste. The knight and the prince are very surprised by this outcry. Reina thinks that these people must be unaware of the effects of hygiene on health. And she says that if all the patients in the village infirmary have fever, it suggests inflammatory diarrhea caused by a toxin-producing bacteria. The protagonist is trying to remember which is the most common cause of infection caused by food poisoning among the possible pathogens. And suddenly the girl remembers something. She turns around and starts to walk away. Zared asks where Ren is going. Ren replies that he's going to the farm. After a while, the protagonist has already arrived at the place where she needed to go. When the girl entered the farm, she saw a man there. Reina approached the man and asked him if he was responsible for the animals that were standing nearby. The man's angry gaze scrutinizes the unknown visitor. He says he's responsible for those animals, but he notices that Ren is not one of the locals, and he assumes that Ren must be one of the prince's servants. The guy replies that his name is Ren, and he's the prince's personal physician. Now the man, when he hears that Ren is a doctor, he gets excited. Ren replies that if the man doesn't mind, he'd like to ask him a few questions. After all, it will take a little time. The man is now kind to the guy, and he agrees to answer the questions. Ren says that his question may seem strange, but he asks if they have noticed a loss of appetite in their pigs or an unhealthy appetite. The man replies that maybe a couple of the pigs have had it, but it's not unusual. After all, everyone has bad days. Reina thinks that the pigs are sick, but not seriously enough to scare the pig farmer. The severity of the disease also depends on the level of stress. Ren asks if he can find out if the pig farmer sold the pigs to the Clements and Grady families. The pig farmer replies that he remembers that happening a few days ago. And now Reina thinks that at the same time, the boy in the infirmary showed the first symptoms. So she turns to the man and asks that the man not take it personally, but she asks if there have been any cases of residents falling ill after eating livestock. When the man hears this, he gets angry and yells. He asks how dare Ren say such a thing. After all, he may be the prince's personal physician, but to accuse him of illness is nothing but an insult. Reina apologizes because she didn't accuse the man of illness. But the pig farmer doesn't listen to the protagonist and tells her to leave his farm. The protagonist thanks the man for his time. When the protagonist leaves the farm, she remembers that the cooks had a similar reaction. She wants to help, but she was too direct. And the girl needs to remember that people don't have any idea about germ theory, so it's no surprise to her that people will be outraged if they think she's blaming them. Locals show symptoms of diarrhea, stomach cramps, or fever, especially after eating pork. Mostly the disease goes away on its own without special treatment. After visiting the farm, Reina was finally convinced of this. It could be salmonella. Reina is sure that she will find more evidence if she goes to the 7 children from the infirmary. After a while, the protagonist was already standing under one of the doors of the house. When the protagonist knocked on the door, a woman opened it. The protagonist introduces that her name is Ren, and she is the prince's personal physician. This morning, she was treating the woman's son in the infirmary. The protagonist asks if she can come in to ask the woman a few questions regarding the children's illness. The woman replies that Ren can come in. When the protagonist has entered the house, the woman asks what Ren wanted to know. Ren asks, "Is it possible that the woman's sons got sick after eating meat bought from the farm?" The woman says that in fact it is, but they eat meat every week, and neither her husband nor her have gotten sick, and only their children have gotten sick. Reina realizes that not everyone gets sick from the bacteria. In fact, children, infants, and people with weakened immune system are in greater danger. The woman asks how her sons are feeling now. She's the one who wanted to visit them. Reina replies that the boys are just a little dehydrated, but not to worry, after all. After Ren gave them a special solution, the boys' condition improved. The woman asks, "Did her son in the pit get better after all?" Suddenly, a girl bursts into the house screaming that she heard that the prince's doctor is here. She asks where the doctor is. Reina gets up from the chair she was sitting on and answers, and the girl must have been looking for her. The girl replies that she just went to the infirmary to visit her son and got some terrible news. The landlady tries to stop Miss Grady. She asks what happened, but Miss replies that she found out that Ren personally made some kind of poison without even getting the church's approval. And now she's yelling about Ren not being a church doctor. Ren replies that ma'am is right, and now Miss Grady insists that Ren is a fraud. After all, only church people know how to make medicine. But Ren dares to teach their healers nonsense and poison. The girl approaches the protagonist and grabs her by her clothes. Ren asks for the girl to calm down and let him explain it, but Miss Grady continues to scream. She asks how Ren can behave like this. She tells Ren to get out of the place. The protagonist tries to justify her actions, but Miss doesn't listen to the healer's words and pushes her outside. The landlady agrees with Miss Katie and thinks that Ren should leave. And that's when the protagonist finds herself behind closed doors. She realizes that everything has gone the same way as her visit to the pig farmer. The girl understands the distrust of these people, but she tries to help. Suddenly, the protagonist notices that there's a prince behind her back, who tells her that Ren has escaped. Zared asks if the protagonist is okay, because they wanted to go with him but stopped at the restroom. Reina says she's fine. She asks if the prince and the knight figured something out. The prince replies that while Ren was busy, he and the knight did their own investigation. This village has good and clean water sources, but little to no proper waste and sewage management. And since Ren talked about the importance of hygiene, the prince asks the villagers how often they wash their hands. The protagonist is eager to hear what the people have answered, but Zared replies that the people answered that they don't wash their hands too often, and Reina realizes that this is what she expected. Now she turns to the prince and says that although she knows it will be difficult, she would like to speak publicly to the villagers because their vision is not their own fault. However, diseases are spreading because of it. The prince asks if Ren is sure she wants to do this. After all, they heard the noise from the claimant's house and the people were clearly in a bad mood. But Reina says she is determined. Because even so, the knowledge she wants to share saves lives. And if the mayor announces her speech, then maybe the residents will be more interested, and this time the protagonist won't be so forthright. But the prince responds that, like he said before they leave the capital, people don't want to accept things that scare them. But if Ren insists, he approves. After a while, the city bells were ringing and shouting for everyone to gather. After all, the princess's personal physician would be making a public appearance. People were surprised. They couldn't believe that the prince's own doctor had come to see them. But people didn't want to gather. They had a lot of work to do. The main character watched everything that was happening, and she was wondering where the prince had gone. But for her, it does not matter, because she is ready to cope. She will present the concept of the theory and explain that no one is guilty of diseases. Then she'll try to convince people that there's nothing to be afraid of. If everyone puts their efforts together, they can help each other stay healthy. Reina hopes she can do it this time. When all the people are gathered, the prince's personal physician thanks the people for joining, and today Ren wants to discuss an important topic. The people are angry. After all, they have heard that Ren is spreading lies. They ask Ren to stop lying. Reina is scared because she hasn't even started to say anything. She tries to calm people down, asking to be listened to. People are yelling that they heard Ren wasn't even trained in the church. At this point, Zared comes up to the protagonist and tries to protect the protagonist from the crowd. People are yelling about how they are not sure Ren is a doctor, and Ren looks more like a heretic. Zared starts telling people to keep their distance. The protagonist was too naive because she thought people would listen to her. Zared turns to the protagonist and asks Ren to stay behind him. After all, they need to get the healer out of this place. Suddenly, the prince arrives and angrily asks what's going on in this place. He asks what all the commotion is about. The people reply that they were just wondering about the doctor's origins. After all, Ren is not a churchman who spreads lies. The prince asks what if his doctor is telling the truth. He asks then which one of them is lying. He wonders if any of the men can confess to the slander. But suddenly, Alphonse appears and shouts for people to stop being so disrespectful to Mr. Ren. At this time, two boys are standing next to the local doctor. Alphonse, tell that when he found out that Ren wasn't trained in the church, he was scared too. But now the local doctor is asking to be believed because Ren is not really a fraud. He's asking people to take a look at these two kids. Now people are discussing that these are the children of the Claments and Grady families. Sir Ren cured these boys with a mixture from an unknown church. But if it was weed, the children would not be alive and well now. When the girls saw their sons, they ran up to them and began to hug them. They hoped their sons were okay. After all, they thought their children had drunk the poison. But the son replies that he's fine. He turns to his mother and asks how she could be so rude to the doctor who cured him. The mother apologizes because she just thought her son was being poisoned. But now the son asks his mother to apologize to the master. He asks if mom didn't know that Ren came to their house early yesterday morning. Ren was tired from the long trip, but still visited them because he was worried. And just because their mom doesn't know the doctor doesn't mean they can say those things about him. There are always patients who don't trust doctors. There are always people who look down on people. But even so, there will always be those who appreciate a doctor's hard work. Now the women and their sons approach the doctor and apologize for their erroneous accusations. But Ren replies that the women don't need to apologize. He understands. Suddenly, the farmer shows up and apologizes to everyone. He didn't notice that the pigs he was selling were sick this week and caused the boy's illness. The farmer was too stubborn to admit it. And now he's really sorry about that. Now people are discussing that they were poisoned because the pig farmer sold them sick pigs. And now they think it's the pig farmer's fault. But suddenly Bjorn starts yelling for everyone to be quiet. It's nobody's fault. They just don't have the knowledge that Mr. Ren wanted to share with them. They rarely get help from doctors who don't ask for anything in return. But Mr. Ren is now sharing with them the most important knowledge and cure for free. And this is not how they should express their gratitude. Now Bjorn turns to the healer and apologizes for the behavior of his men. And Bjorn asks Ren to begin his lecture. For a long time, the main character has been telling people how to practice good hygiene and wash their hands. She even showed them how to do it with her own example. But after all the people left, and Reina is glad that the people listened to her. The girl hopes that her speech will help to improve the sanitary conditions of these people. Bjorn approaches the protagonist and thanks her for her informative speech. Bjorn asks if he can ask the girl a question about sterilization techniques. The girl tells him everything that Bjorn asked her to know. At the same time, Zared watches from the sidelines and thinks that everything seems to have gotten better in the end. Suddenly, the prince appears next to the knight. And now Zared realized where the prince had run off to this morning. And Zared has time to think that the prince really did leave them alone with the crowd. The prince replies that of course he wouldn't have done that. He wants Zared to believe in him just a little bit. Zared asks if Damien believed in Ren much. Zared asks what if the boy had not recovered and there was no confirmation of the doctor's ability. But the prince says that's impossible. Ren is his personal physician after all. Zared observes the girl from the side and realizes that the prince is actually right. After all, she is really amazing. After a while, the protagonist was already going up to her room to sleep. She was thinking about how much had happened, and she still had to go back to the infirmary to check on the remaining patients. She was already walking towards the bed. As the girl walked to the door and knocked, the rooms heard the prince's voice saying that the guy doesn't need to knock as long as they share a room. At this time, the prince was sitting at a desk with papers. But Reina replies that she doesn't mean that she meant to ask if there would be a change of clothes. But the prince asks why the healer is confused by this. He asks, "Is there something wrong with his body?" But Reina gets nervous and says there's nothing wrong. After all, the prince has a beautiful body. Now the prince starts laughing. The girl notices the prince's smile and thinks about the fact that Damien laughs very rarely, but it's nice to see the guy like that. He should laugh more often. But Reina thinks that princes need to laugh not at her. The protagonist sits on the bed and talks about how she's grateful to the prince anyway. After all, if Damien hadn't brought the boys the healer and the swineherd, she doesn't know how it would have ended. But the prince asks why he shouldn't help his doctor, especially when he was so brave. Reina turns to the prince asking if she can ask why the prince is so against the surgery. The prince replies that maybe the doctor will think it's silly, but Reina replies that if it's a reason that affects princes so much, it can't be silly. As a child before the prince met Zared, he saw soldiers returning from war. They were covered in blood and abrasions. Their arms and legs were amputated due to severe wounds. Damien was just a kid who had never seen so much blood before. And it was very horrible for the kid, for he was frightened. And now the prince wonders if it's foolish for the doctor. After all, the future ruler of the kingdom is afraid of blood and surgery. But the protagonist replies that it's not stupid at all. There's no need to be ashamed of your injuries. It always takes time to deal with them. And Ren believes that the prince will be cured. At this point, the prince goes to the doctor and asks Ren to call him by his first name instead of his highness. It turns out that all this time Zared was standing behind the wall and heard the conversation between the prince and the protagonist. And now Zared doesn't understand what strange feelings he has inside. Meanwhile, in the kingdom, Vanya and her parents are sitting at breakfast, and Vanya tells them how Ren made chocolate from cocoa beans. Father replies that Vanya seems to appreciate this doctor very much. Mother asks, "Isn't that the doctor who proposed the bacteria theory?" The woman replies that it's a rather fascinating theory, but as she told their ruler, the suggestion that their world was teeming with unseen threats would only frighten the people, especially if shared so unexpectedly, which is why they ordered Damien to make a detailed report of the doctor's investigation. Vanya turns to her parents and tells them that she is a little surprised that they have taken the doctor's ideas so lightly. She has faith in her brother, but she asks, "Don't the parents doubt him at all?" The father replies that an excellent ruler like him believes that new knowledge must be embraced, especially for the development of the kingdom. And Damien, as heir to the throne, was raised on the same notions. The father wants to talk about the church, but suddenly he feels sick. And the woman turns to the ruler and says that he has mentioned the church so many times this week. The governor apologizes, but he has no respect for those who would go to their heads in their quest for power. The influence the church has over their people is hurting the kingdom, like poison poisoning their hearts with no chance of recovery. The way they handled that incident with the witch. Vanya asks in surprise what her father is talking about. The ruler replies something the matter happened before their daughter was born. He says that 50 years ago the witch was a prominent person. She was the only one who could compete with the church in power and influence. At this point, the lady turns to her husband and says that this is not a good time to discuss such things. She asks the governor to let their daughter eat in peace. But the governor replies that this is nonsense, because Vanya must be aware of the affairs of their kingdom. Her father tells her that there has always been a balance of power between their family and the church. And with the witch gone, the church's influence has increased too much. Vanya asks what father means by that, and now father thinks that Ren will be useful to their cause. After a while, the protagonist and the prince and knight set off. At this time, Reina sneezes and says that apparently someone is talking about her. The prince replies that maybe it's the villagers pining for her chocolate. Zared says that it's a good thing Ren took plenty of chocolate, or else they would have had to flee every village in passing. The protagonist replies that she is glad that the other villages are more open to the new knowledge. The prince turns to the protagonist and says that Ren has done a good job, and it's a good job. But Ren replies that it's not worth praising him. He was just doing his job. The girl calls the prince His Highness again. And at that moment, the prince replies that his name is Damien. The protagonist wasn't surprised that the prince said his name. Well, then she understood. After all, the prince had told her to call him by his first name. And now the protagonist thinks that since that night, Damien's been treating her better, for some reason. Now his smile can catch the protagonist off guard. And now Reina worries that the prince might be up to something. Suddenly, Zared breaks through this conversation and talks about how they are almost there. The knight can't wait to sleep in his own bed. The prince replies that sharing his bed with the knight was unforgettable. Zared replies that they can have that memory anytime. The prince replies that he would only do it as a last resort. The protagonist hears this conversation, laughs. Moments later, they are already inside the manor, and the prince is greeted. Welcome back. Reina sits down tiredly on the couch in the living room. She thinks about how tired she was during the trip. At that moment, Zared turns to the prince and asks if Damien wasn't going to rest. But the prince replies that he needs to show their progress to his father. After all, the prince is sure that his father already knows that they have arrived and can come any minute. But suddenly Vanya appears and runs to the doctor, screaming about how much she missed him. The prince looks at his sister in surprise and asks if Vanya has forgotten that the prince is around. Vanya turns to the doctor and talks about someone talking. She asks if Ren can hear that annoying sound. But at that moment, Vanya turns around and says that it's her brother. So the girl runs over and kisses her brother on the cheek. The prince replies that this kiss is definitely filled with sincerity. He asks, "Are the mother and father still at the court?" Vanya replies that the parents have just finished. In fact, she is here to summon them all to the throne room. Ren asks in surprise, "Is he being summoned too?" It's his first time meeting the king and queen. Reina asks why she's being summoned, but Vanya replies that her father wants to ask the doctor something. Reina doesn't understand why Vanya seems so worried. After a while, they enter the throne room. Reina is surprised at how everything is arranged. It's the first time she sees the king and queen. Everyone is bowing to the ruler, and Reina is watching from the sidelines. She is thinking how she should greet. At that moment, she remembers she's a boy and just bows to the ruler. The queen congratulates her son on his return. Damien replies that he is happy to see his parents. The father missed his son's face. Damien replies that he doesn't understand that. After all, it would have been enough for the father to just look in the mirror. After all, they are very similar in appearance. At this time, Reina is thinking that the king and queen are beautiful. And no wonder Damien and Vanya look so good. The king talks about how he can't believe that his son has finally introduced his personal physician to him. Damien apologizes. He is pleased to introduce his personal physician Ren to his parents. Ren has shown himself to be a well-informed and competent doctor. The protagonist bows to the rulers, saying that it is an honor to meet them. She hopes she is doing the right thing. The ruler speaks to the doctor and says that Vanya is delighted with the doctor and his culinary skills. After all, even Zared has praised him. So even though it's their first meeting, they want Ren to be sure they think very highly of him. They thank the doctor for taking care of their son. Now the father turns to his son and asks why the prince should not share what he has learned from the investigation. Damien replies that he has compiled all the information into a report. He asks that his father take a look. The servant gives the report to the queen, and the queen says that her son is a very hard worker. The father notices that, as expected, people were alarmed but still want to learn. Damien speaks to his father and says that the ruler should know that Ren has not only found out the source of the illnesses troubling the people, but has also volunteered to teach them how to improve sanitation. Now the governor turns to the knight and asks if Zared has anything to add. Zared believes that they should give the Ren teachings the support they need to improve the sewage and waste disposal infrastructure in the villages. Zared believes that these actions can reduce the incidence of disease and improve living conditions. Now it seems to the king that all honors belong to the doctor. But Ren turns to His Majesty and talks about how she couldn't have accomplished all this without the prince and the knight. She was just doing what she could. The king replies that this modesty is commendable. Now the queen turns to her husband and says that if Ren is really as good a teacher as they say, then she asks if the king thinks that doctors should be utilized more in the capital. The queen asks if that's what the ruler wanted. It turns out that the parents were whispering at the time, and Damien gets angry and doesn't understand why his parents are whispering about something right in front of them. The king goes to the doctor and asks for Ren to come to him, because the ruler has a favor to ask of him, has a request. The king asks if Ren could give a lecture on sanitation at the capital medical university. Reina thinks she's given a few lectures before, but not for the royal family. But there's only one right answer. She agrees. Then the ruler asks that the doctor speak in a week, and Damien will take care of everything necessary. After some time, the protagonist goes to the prince's room. She thinks about the fact that even though the prince asked her to call him by his name, the protagonist is still embarrassed to do it in public. After all, maybe she should only do it in private. When Reina knocks on the door, the prince tells Ren to come out. Ren asks if Damien summoned him. Damien replies that he's glad Ren remembered to call him by his name. The prince asks for the doctor to take a seat next to him. Reina doesn't understand why the prince looks so serious. The prince wanted something to discuss with the doctor. The protagonist agrees. She doesn't realize what could be so important that even that can't wait until morning. The prince says that first he asks that the doctor allow a brief history of their state. The prince tells him that the church was established centuries ago, long before the royal family took root in the country. The church was a leader among institutions even before the kingdom was founded. And ever since the country was established, the royal family took the throne, the church and the monarchs began to vie for power. And this political rivalry has not diminished over the years, but has grown deeper. And then Ren shows up. Ren asks what he has to do with politics. The prince tells him that the capital medical university was founded by the church, and most of the students who graduate from it become clergymen. If Ren is a member of the royal family, he'll teach something at a university filled with church people. Damien asks what Ren thinks will happen, but Reina assumes she's in for a not-so-warm welcome. The prince tells her that his father hopes the doctor will make a positive impression on the royal family. The church has become an important part of ordinary people's lives, but the doctor has knowledge and skills that cannot be overlooked. The prince's parents have the best interests of their people at heart, but to use the doctor as a pawn in their political game, it's wrong. And Damien says if Ren fears it's too great a responsibility for him, he'll tell his father. He asks that Ren not force himself to do it. Reina thinks that she doesn't feel used at all. On the contrary, she feels like she's been given another opportunity to change the world. She doesn't see why she shouldn't take this opportunity. She thanks the prince for his concern, but replies that despite political matters, it's her duty. If her actions will help people, she doesn't see why she should avoid it. The prince asks, is it really true that despite what he said, Reina will still give a lecture at the university? Reina replies that she will definitely do it. The prince replies that in that case he is obliged to trust the doctor and replies that Ren is free to go. When the protagonist left the prince's office, she didn't understand. Suddenly, Zared appears next to the protagonist and asks if he can talk to the doctor. After all, he has something to say. The protagonist and Zared go to the kitchen. Reina says that the hot chocolate will be ready soon. Suddenly, Zared wants to say something to the girl, but when Reina turns to the guy, Zared says that the hot chocolate smells good. The main character asks, is Zared excited? But the knight replies that he's always so excited. Now, Zared is trying to collect his thoughts and realize what he's saying. At this time, the main character gives the guy a hot chocolate. Zared thanks the girl for it. He tells her that this is the first time Reina has ever offered him hot chocolate. The main character asks in surprise, is that so? Zared recalls that Reina has never made him at least a cup since the first time she made chocolate in the kitchen. Reina had completely forgotten about that. Zared replies that it's his Ronnie. Reina didn't mean to do that. She's sorry. She says that if the knight gets better, he can have her cup too. The girl is afraid that she might have offended her friend, but Zared replies that he's just joking and there's nothing wrong with it. After all, he's not that petty. After a while, they stood in awkward silence, and Zared thought he should say something, but he didn't understand why it was so hard for him. And Reina noticed that the knight wanted to say something, And at that moment, they turn to each other and start talking at the same time. When the two try to say something at the same time, they start laughing. And Zared tells Reina to speak first. But Reina wants Zared to speak first, and then Zared says yes, we should go first. But Reina says she's also Ren, so she doesn't have to give in. Zared replies that the protagonist is right, and Reina starts laughing. Zared doesn't understand if a girl can stop being so nice. Reina asks what the knight wanted to tell her. Zared doesn't understand where these feelings came from. He doesn't understand when he started treating this girl differently. How gratitude admiration turned into something else. Zared swore to protect this girl so he can't wrongly burden her with this. Not now. Zared turns to the girl and talks about how she needs to be careful with the church. Reina replies that Damien has already warned her. She knows about the conflict between the church and the royal family, and now she's being used as a pawn. But she tells the knight not to worry. She understands, and this is an opportunity for her to help people. Still, she thanks the guy for worrying about her. The main character asks, "Is that really all Zared wanted to tell her?" The knight replies that it is. So Reina asks for permission to wash the cups before they go to bed. But suddenly Zared comes up to the protagonist and hugs her. The girl tries to understand what is going on, but the knight only asks Reina to be careful. After a while, the protagonist has already gone to the seamstress. She thanks Madame City Wind the surgical gown is sewn very well. At this time, the surgical gown was put on the main character. In addition to everything, the girl only needs surgical gloves, but she doubts that there are rubber gloves in this world. City thanks the guy for such compliments, and Vanya admires how the gowns actually look in person. Ren says it's really amazing. Reina wanted to say it's just like her world, but she stopped herself from saying that. And now Vanya's wondering, where else has Ren seen robes like this? Reina thinks back to the world she used to live in. Even though everyone here is very friendly, she still misses her past life. Vanya goes to Madame City and talks about how her work has literally brought the doctor to tears, and they hope it's in a good way. Vanya says that Ren looks awfully pale, and she's going to go get some drinks to freshen him up. Vanya walks out of this room, and now we give City turns to the guy and talks about how it must be difficult. But Ren doesn't understand what City means. But City replies that it's hard to be in a new, unfamiliar place and take on such responsibility. Ren thanks the madam, but he replies that he's fine. Suddenly, the protagonist notices that there is a breast strap on the floor. The protagonist picks it up with her hands, and City thinks the protagonist will need it. Reina doesn't understand how City could know such a thing. But City tells the protagonist to keep her voice down. She asks if the girl is going to give a lecture at medical school tomorrow. So City asks the protagonist to be careful. The protagonist realizes that tomorrow she'll run into people from the church, and the unknown may await her. After a while, the protagonist stood at the door of the capital's medical university. Next to her was the prince and the knight. Reina hoped she would make it. At that moment, Mr. Giles appeared to greet His Majesty. The prince replies that he is only here to introduce them to his personal Dr. Ren and his escort, Sir Zared. For as they know, Ren will be giving a lecture today. Giles replies that he is the headmaster of this university, and he welcomes Ren. Ren is delighted to meet the headmaster and give a lecture here. It's an honor. Giles replies that he's always happy to host people from the royal family. They are humble servants of the church and have always listened to the royal requests, despite their occasional lack of long attention. Damien replies that he is greatly indebted to their generous hospitality. But in his heart, Damien hates dealing with these arrogant snakes. The director asks the guests to follow him. The protagonist starts to walk, but she turns around and notices that she is still there. She asks, "Isn't Damien going to go along with them?" Damien replies that he has some business to attend to, and Zared will be Ren's chaperone. The prince approaches the protagonist and whispers to Ren not to worry so much. After all, he knows Ren can handle it. Giles turns to the knight and says that it seems His Highness is quite close to his personal physician. But Zared replies that Mr. Giles thinks they are so close that they can gossip about matters that do not concern them at all. Giles responds that the insolence of a knight suits me. At this point, they're already there. They are approached by Ren, who apologizes for the wait. Giles replies that he has reached an age when he can no longer wait patiently for a child. He asks to be understood. Ren replies that of course he agrees. Giles asks to follow him. They walk through the garden. Suddenly, the protagonist notices a statue. She asks the principal who it is. The principal asks, "Didn't Ren recognize the High Lord High Priest of Sikarth?" The knight apologizes. After all, they did not mean to offend Mr. Giles. He asks that the Lord understand that they have nothing to do with the church. The headmaster replies that then they just need to be enlightened in the teachings of their God. Giles tells them that throughout history their God has bestowed many blessings on all mankind, especially Master Sikarth, the kingdom's greatest hero who developed medicine. If it wasn't for Master Sikarth and his contributions, they would have continued to blindly succumb to common diseases, needlessly suffering without treatment. The protagonist listens to this and doesn't realize that the witch hasn't made many medical advances, especially in the treatment of the poor. After all, Albie said that the witch was a legendary woman healer with amazing powers of healing who helped everyone without asking for anything in return. Well, Giles goes on to say that Mr. Sikarth was the one who led a fearless and sustained sweep of demonic witches from their sacred kingdom. The protagonist doesn't understand. Are they really talking about a witch sweep now? But Giles replies that he's getting too carried away. At this point, he's sure they'll have a great time teaching at their honorary university. Though Ren has no lord or student status here, they'll accept his conviction with impartiality as always. After all, no one knows. However, it's unlikely that Ren has knowledge they don't have. After a while, they enter the university building, and the protagonist thinks that she is definitely not welcome here. But she doesn't understand. Is there anything worse than what she encountered in the villages? I mean, surely the students would be more open to new ideas. The students are discussing who Reina and Zared are. After all, they've heard that the royal aide is going to give a lecture, and that tall, dark guy is the captain of the royal guard. And it turns out that the skinny guy is going to be giving the lecture. The protagonist thinks she was too optimistic. The headmaster asks that Zared and Ren wait in the room until they get the audience ready for their talk. And Giles will call them when it's done, while he asks that Ren and Zared not walk around the building. Zared replies that he can't say he's ever had a good relationship with the people of the church, but Giles has been the worst. The main character is still what she is told. After all, she won't back down. And even if the students don't trust the royal family or call her a mere assistant, she has a job to do. And the protagonist must clearly convey information. After all, she has to do it for the people of this world. Suddenly, they make some strange noises. The protagonist asks what's going on. But Zared asks Reina to stay in the room and he goes to check. Reina asks Zared to be careful. She decides to look at her notes for now. The protagonist starts screaming because she can't concentrate while she is so worried. Why is Zared taking so long? She decides to go look for where Zared is. Well, when the protagonist wants to leave the room, Zared is already standing at the door. The protagonist asks what's going on, but at that moment Zared replies that they'd better get out of this place as soon as possible. The protagonist wants Zared to tell her what's going on. She asks why the guy decided to do this, but Zared replies that it's for her safety. Knight doesn't think they should be lecturing. They can't take that risk. Zared grabs the protagonist by the arm and starts to lead her away, but Reina asks Zared to explain to her what's going on. Suddenly, the girl pushes the guy and puts him on a chair. The girl asks for Zared to calm down. She asks for the knight to tell her what happened. Zared replies that he doesn't want to scare the girl. He just knows it might shock her. After all, they don't usually talk about witches in the palace. Zared tells her that people talked about witches about female doctors, whom the church recognized as heretics. The protagonist tries to find out what these people actually said. Zared tells that he went to the sound and saw the students gathered around the road. The principal was also among them. Then Zared saw the girl, and even without words, the protagonist understood what Zared meant. An innocent woman had been murdered, and Reina can live so well because Zared protects her. But she doesn't realize how many women have been killed for that reason, and if she can save them. So Zared believes it's best for them to leave, and if anyone finds out that Ren is really a girl, she's in trouble. And Zared doesn't know if he can keep her safe in that case. Even the royal family is powerless. Reina doesn't want to die, but she'd rather risk it than give up the life she's chosen. The protagonist. She's been in this world for quite some time now. She's met people from this world and seen their problems. And the protagonist began to think that even if she dies soon, she should bring change to this world. So the protagonist insists that she must give a lecture. Zared is surprised. He asks, would Reina do it after what he said? But the protagonist replies that she must, because she also wonders if the royal family will be ridiculed if their representative runs away after saying a word to me. Zared replies that the protagonist is right, but her safety is more important. Reina replies that the knight shouldn't worry because she has to do it. Zared replies that he won't be allowed to stand next to the girl while she's giving a lecture, because it is unacceptable to let guards into a place of learning, but he can't stop the protagonist. Reina replies that she understands everything and can handle herself. Suddenly, Giles comes into the room and says that the main classroom is ready. Giles appears next to them and he hopes that Mr. Wren had a good rest. The main character thanks the principal for his concern. Now the girl wonders how much of a witch Giles killed. Asks if he's finished reading his little notebook about Mr. Wren. After all, he hopes the doctor has had plenty of time to prepare. Wren replies that he has. Giles says that's good. After all, the students at this academy are quite inquisitive and have opinions of their own. And Giles hopes that Wren will be able to satisfy their interest. He also believes that Sir Zared is capable of waiting in this room until the end of the lecture. The knight replies that he will, after all, and Giles says that's fine. He turns around and tells the protagonist to follow him. That's when Reina hears the students talking about how it's over. The students don't understand why teachers always make such a fuss. Reina is surprised. These people call themselves doctors, but life means so little to them. They talk about it like they're talking about the weather. The protagonist walks into the auditorium where a huge number of students are waiting for her, and she at least notices a familiar scene. At this time, Principal Giles asks for silence from everyone, as they all know they have a visitor from the royal palace. He says this is Wren, Prince Damien's personal physician, and he'll be giving a lecture today. He asks that the students give the doctor their attention. The students are already discussing the fact that Wren was not trained in the church. They're also discussing the execution that happened today. The protagonist tries to reassure herself that her uniform is not visible and no one will recognize her as a girl. Therefore, a girl shouldn't be afraid. At this time, Wren is already starting to greet all the students. They can call him Mr. Wren, and he's honored to be their teacher today. And the first topic Wren wants to discuss with the students is the germ theory of disease. The students don't understand what germs are. It sounds ridiculous to them. The protagonist realizes that once again she has a lot to prove because they won't believe her. Wren says that he knows the theory sounds strange to the students, but he asks permission to continue. According to the microbial theory, diseases are caused by intestinal organisms or microorganisms invisible to the human eye. They're called germs. The protagonist rejoices in her heart and thanks Antony van Leeuwenhoek for discovering bacteria and thanks Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur for proving the validity of the theory through experiments. So Reina addresses the students and tells them that since germs are able to spread from person to person and surface to surface, it is important to practice medicine under sterile conditions. This is especially true on the operating table. Otherwise, there's a risk of complications. Therefore, disinfectants such as antiseptic sprays were invented to prevent the spread of germs. But the protagonist is wondering, because she doesn't understand how people could invent antiseptic sprays if they didn't know about germs. Suddenly, a student raises her hand and asks her to ask a question. Reina didn't think she was about to be asked a question. She didn't even finish explaining. But the student says that if he is not that stupid, it is obvious that the antiseptic spray was created because of miasmas. The protagonist doesn't get it. Is it really that outdated theory about bad air? And now it seems to her that the knowledge of these disciples is similar to the ideas of her world as well. The student apologizes and asks if Wren even knows the essence of the miasm theory. After all, Wren must not have heard of it if he's talking about germs. And the student gives his word that Wren just made up his own theory because he didn't have the opportunity to study in the church. The student doesn't realize who Wren thinks he is. He's just an uneducated amateur. Reina doesn't get it. Does this guy really think she made up this theory? She tells him that the miasm theory is the belief that diseases are caused by stinky air. The student is surprised by the doctor's answer. He doesn't understand. Did someone teach him that, and how did Wren learn it? Wren goes on to say that also according to this theory, people can get infected by inhaling harmful vapors. that contain disease-causing agents. And Ren is here to explain why this belief is outdated and how to practice good hygiene in everyday life to prevent contracting germs. The students are very angry about what Ren is saying. The principal thought this guy was a fool, but he's exceeded his expectations. And now all his students will see how the royal family brought this misunderstanding to their noble institution. The headmaster thinks it's all unfolded exactly as the Supreme Lord of Sickheart predicted. The protagonist thinks that maybe she shouldn't have said it so harshly, but the girl knows she's right and asks all the students to be quiet. The students ask if Ren even knows what he's talking about. His words are unquestionable, and he has the nerve to say their theory is outdated. It's ridiculous to them. Suddenly, there's a guy in a raincoat at the back of the class who asks, "Doesn't anyone here know about respect?" He asks if church students always behave this way in front of their mentors. The principal asks the guy who he is. After all, this guy doesn't look like their student. Giles thinks that they can't have someone defending the king's man. But when the guy pulls off his hood, it turns out to be Prince Damien. The protagonist is surprised. She doesn't understand why Damien's here. Giles tries to figure out how Damien got in. The students also start discussing the fact that it's His Highness Prince Damien. They don't understand. Has the prince been with them all this time? Giles turns to His Highness and apologizes for such a revival, without the students of the medical university just eager to learn. Now he asks that the students be quiet and show respect to Mr. After all, they are rarely visited by the royal family, so today is an unusual day. Now the students agree with the principal's words. The principal realizes that things have not gone according to plan. Suddenly, a man comes up and asks the students to take what Mr. Ren is trying to tell them seriously. The protagonist notices that it's Mr. Ralph, the father of Urges. She didn't notice that Ralph was here too. Ralph says he's a capable young man who saved his son who was on the verge of death. Giles gets angry. He doesn't understand what Ralph is saying or why he hasn't talked about this guy before. Ralph tells them that Mr. Ren was a doctor who taught him an amazing medical technique called an appendectomy. The disciples don't realize wasn't this technique in their writings just a short time ago. The students knew that Ralph had written it. They started incorporating the technique into their surgical lectures. And now they realize what an amazing man he is. Ralph asks if there's anything Mr. Ren needs, for it seems they need teaching materials for the demonstration. Now the protagonist realizes that this is the only way she can dispel these people's doubts, because she's sure someone must have invented it by now, and she decides to take a chance and ask. She thanks Mr. Ralph. She asks if Mr. Ralph can bring the microscopes and some water from the fountain. Mr. Ralph agrees. He wonders what Mr. Ren is going to do with the water from the fountain. Damien also doesn't understand what Ren is going to do with such dirty water. The students discuss the fact that they only use the microscope to look at plant leaves and incisions. The protagonist notices Damien walking towards her. The prince thinks about how he's glad he's here until he can't say anything more. The protagonist is indeed glad Damien is here too. After a while, Ralph is back in the audience and he apologizes for the wait. Raina thanks Mr. Ralph for what he brought. She can't believe she saw the antique microscope with her own eyes. Ralph asks what he needs to do with it. Ren asks that Ralph just watch the water from the fountain in the specimen holder. When Ralph started looking through the microscope, he was surprised. The wind turns out that there are creatures in there and they are alive. The main character tells him that what Ralph saw under the microscope were microorganisms in the water. They can be both beneficial and harmful to humans. Giles thinks they're lying, but Damien wants to see it all too. Ren says if anyone wants to test the theory, they can queue up behind Mr. Ralph. And note that microbe is a general term for all organisms that are too small to be seen with the naked eye. He asks that students remember that miasmas don't cause disease. Microbes do. Meanwhile, Knight Zared is very worried. He doesn't understand what's happening to Raina, and he swears to himself that if a single hair of hers is touched, he'll deal with everyone on the spot. But in reality, all the students are lined up to see what germs are. After a while, all the students dispersed, and the main character thanked them for attending the lecture. The students discussed whether they thought it was a great lecture. After all, they had never seen such organisms before. It's a little creepy for them to realize that these microscopic creatures are everywhere, but they realize they just have to wash their hands with soap and water and they'll be safe. The student who was the angriest says that he still can't believe that the miasma theory isn't true. Another student asks if the guy thinks the teachings of the church might be false. But another guy intervenes in the conversation and asks the students not to say that, because no school is perfect, and that's why they have to be open about these things. At this time, the main character was talking to the prince, but suddenly the doors open and Knight Zered bursts in. He walks up to the protagonist and asks if Ren is okay. Ren replies that he is perfectly fine and thanks the knight for his concern. Zered notices that His Highness the Princess is here and so is Mr. Ralph. The prince replies that they were so here. They decide to leave after all, it has been a long day. The protagonist says goodbye to Mr. Ralph. She thanks him for all that Ralph has done for her. The gentleman replies that it's been a pleasure. To hear about this amazing new theory, the protagonist asks if they shouldn't say goodbye to the principal because he suddenly walked out of the classroom after looking through the microscope. Reina wonders if it would be rude to just leave like that, but the prince tells her not to worry. Damien wouldn't be surprised if Giles is just waiting for them to leave. He asks that Ren not bother with the rules of decorum if Giles doesn't follow them himself. Ren replies that he believes the prince is right. Suddenly, the protagonist is dizzy, and Damien asks if Ren is all right, but Ren starts to fall. He apologizes. He doesn't know why it's happening to him. The prince asks if the doctor is okay. The protagonist thanks them for their concern because she's a little tired and there's nothing wrong with that. But the truth is, Reina can't stop thinking about it. Damien says that Ren did a great job. Reina asks how often those executions happen. The prince replies that it happens about one execution every few months, even though they're on church grounds. But Damien can't accept their actions. One day, the church recognizes a whole group of women trying to teach and practice medicine. But the prince tells them that they must return to the palace, for their carriage is waiting. In the evening, Vanya comes to the doctor's room. She was going to visit Ren as soon as he arrives, but her brother says the doctor needs to rest. Vanya asks how Ren is feeling. At this time, Ren is crying, but he replies that he is happy to be back. Vanya approaches the doctor and asks how the lecture went. It's hard for the protagonist to keep this secret, being a female doctor and living in constant fear. After all, it's not right. She can't even do anything about it. She can't save other female doctors from their fate, but she doesn't realize if there are other women who hide their identity to practice medicine. She has never felt so helpless. Ren wipes his tears and talks about how he didn't want Vanya to see him in such a pathetic state, but Vanya replies that Dr. Wen doesn't have to tell her. But Vanya asks to let Ren know that she is willing to listen to anything if he feels like sharing. She asks, "Is it really hard for the guy right now?" At this point, Vanya hugs the protagonist and says that she will support him no matter what. Now the protagonist doesn't wonder if Kate would change her mind if she knew who Ren really is. Meanwhile, Giles goes to the master and tells him that the guy showed them germs through a microscope. The magister asks how a simple guy could learn from the existence of microbes. The magister wonders who the guy's master is, but Giles replies that he didn't ask. The magister starts yelling and says that Ren is a fool. He asks that Ren get out of his office and gather all the information he can find on this guy, and find out everything.